We're going to get started. So first of all, welcome to Waterloo, welcome to Shopify Plus, and welcome to ETHWaterloo. My name is Nabil. I'm one of the organizers of ETHWaterloo, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you here today for an unbelievably special talk that we're thrilled to put together for you guys. I'd like to just take a moment to thank a number of parties and do some housekeeping with respects to where the washrooms are. The washrooms are in the back on the second floor if you go up these stairs. The women's washroom's on the left, the men's washroom's on the right, and there's an additional washroom past the yoga room over here on the left. Today, we are here in the Seagram's Whiskey Distillery, which is now known as Shopify Plus. It has been home to many different tech companies over the course of time here in Waterloo. And today, it's home to the fastest growing enterprise commerce solution in the world. It's Shopify's enterprise offering. I've had the distinct pleasure of helping found the team here locally, and they're 300 strong and growing to about 1,000 tech workers here in Uptown Waterloo. We are deeply indebted to Shopify for providing this facility, not just for the talks here today and the panel, but also for all the workshops that are happening throughout ETHWaterloo so that we could have as many hackers as possible next door at the Center for International Governance Innovation. The Center for International Governance Innovation has been an unbelievable partner in this endeavor. The idea started way back when Liam and a couple of other enthusiasts in the blockchain space who are passionate about creating a leadership position for Canada in this technology. So back in June or so, Liam said, hey, why don't we do this thing where we do this hackathon, which will be the biggest in the world, and it's the most important technology, he thought, that is being built today. And so if it wasn't for the Center for International Governance Innovation, none of this would be possible. So we're deeply indebted to them for helping partner with us on this. We also would like to thank Gowlings as one of the lead sponsors, and there's a number of partners of Gowlings here in the room, including the lead lawyer who's running their blockchain practice, which I believe has 85 lawyers and counting. And so Gowlings is taking also a leadership position in that respect from a Canadian perspective. But today we have 4 incredibly special speakers, and I'd just like to start by mentioning that when it comes to blockchain technology and decentralized applications in the decentralized future, we literally have the world's leading foremost scientist sitting right here in the front row. His name is Vitalik Buterin, and he dropped out of the University of Waterloo after first year in order to start and found Ethereum with a number of other special individuals. He's the visionary behind the technology and the leading scientist, and he's literally ahead of the technology, talking about where the future is going. And before Vitalik addresses the crowd, I think it's also worth mentioning that Vitalik has won a number of awards. I think this audience should probably know who he is, but he's recently also won the World Technology Award in the networking category, edging out Mark Zuckerberg. So that's pretty cool. And the other recipients during that time were seminaries along with like Elon Musk and whatnot. Then before Vitalik, we have Joseph Lubin, another Canadian, who's really on the forefront on the implementation side of this technology. He has 370 employees, most of which are based in Brooklyn, and or not Brooklyn, 24 countries worldwide. Forgive me. It's a little bit intimidating introducing these speakers, but nevertheless, we're thrilled to have Joseph back in his hometown of Toronto, and so we're thrilled to have him here at ETHWaterloo. You'll be hearing a lot more about what his company ConsenSys is up to. He's the founder and CEO of ConsenSys. And so we also have Dr. Julie Maupin, who's a senior fellow and researcher at the Center for International Governance Innovation. She's a lawyer and an economist and a self-proclaimed blockchain geek. And so we're thrilled to have her as well on the panel, and she will also be delivering a keynote as well. Also, we have William Mougayar. William Mougayar is actually an entrepreneur and an investor. He's also the author of The Business Blockchain, and he's co-founded a number of companies, of which I won't get into, including a blockchain index. So we'll be pleased to hear from him today, and he will be the one moderating the panel later today. This building was built by a Canadian architect named Barton Myers. Legendary architect. This building has won an award, a Governor General Award, and Barton Myers also opened up a practice in Los Angeles. So effectively, this is a beautiful piece of Canadian architecture, but really we're here today to talk about the leading digital architects, and that's what this panel here is about today. The talk is entitled, How Decentralized Technology Will Impact Our Society. And there's no one better than the panel that we have here today to talk about that. So with that, I'd also just like to take a couple of seconds to recognize some of the other special individuals that we have here in the room. And if you don't mind just standing up and doing a quick wave when I mention your name, that would be appreciated. So I guess I'll start on the far right over there. So we have the Mayor of the City of Kitchener, Barry Verbanovic. We have a Federal Member of Parliament, the Honorable Raj Saini, right beside him. The one-time, long-time Executive Director of the Center for International Governance Innovation is a gentleman named Dr. English, who is the official biographer of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, as well as Lester Pearson, was the chair of the Museum of Civilization in Ottawa, and so many other things. But Dr. John English is here with us today as well. Hi, John. And then, of course, we have the Mayor of Waterloo, who is himself a computer scientist, longtime BlackBerry executive, and a personal friend, Dave Jaworski. I'd also like to take a second to say that we have another very special dignitary here. She's not only the Member of Parliament for Waterloo, but she's also the Federal Minister of Small Business and Tourism, and she has a third job, and she is the Leader of the Government in the House of Commons, otherwise known as Government House Leader, the first ever female in the role, and that's Minister Chagger in the back, Bardish Chagger. Hi, Bardish. Thank you for coming. And really, there's so many other people to thank, and we really, really appreciate you being here. I don't want to take up much more of your time. We're going to be hearing first from Joseph Lubin, and I couldn't be more stoked. Please come on up, Joseph.
Thank you, Nabil. First, would like to express enormous gratitude to Nabil, Liam, Mark, and the many volunteers that made this epic event possible in this epic setting. Really incredible. And kudos for the genius of running a parallel next to this highly energized hackathon, a parallel slackathon for us to sit here and eat sandwiches and lounge around talking about important things. So you're going to hear the word decentralization, decentralizing quite a bit here today. And some people think of it as a movement. I think of it as a phenomenon, something that happens to civilizations when, after millennia of top-down command and control, millennia of hierarchy, their civilizations get to the point where they've wrapped the planet in layers and layers of instantaneous communication networks and come up with a technology that allows people all over the world to make very rapid or instantaneous decisions. So top-down command and control is an appropriate organizing principle when communication is slow and expensive and decision-making is equally difficult, slow and expensive. But once you have the right infrastructure in place, we have the opportunity to do much better. So Satoshi Nakamoto, person or group, invented at least two things, probably three things, in November 2008, November or January 2009. The first was Bitcoin, basically an application, an experiment in monetary theory, a payment system. The second and most important was the foundation upon which that application was built, the blockchain. The blockchain is a breakthrough in computer science. It's a new kind of database system upon which we can build applications that we can all trust. We can all trust them because based on the consensus mechanisms, we can be certain that no minority set of actors can improperly manipulate the system, the data, because they can inspect it. Ethereum took that one step further and applied that to the programs as well. Vitalik was living a somewhat centralized life. He first in Russia, then in Toronto, then in Waterloo, and I believe he, after being turned on to Bitcoin by his father, he explored it a little bit later and came to the conclusion that I think in consultation with Dmitry that he should decentralize his life. And so he traveled the world and encountered a bunch of different attempts to use this foundational technology, blockchain, to enable people to build better applications. And so he worked on a handful of projects and finally came to the conclusion that a lot of these projects were building things in an unscalable way, and so he took a step back and wrote the white paper describing the Ethereum platform. So took a little while to get the system built, but it's quite profound that following the organizing principle of decentralization, and we did a token launch that effectively had the receipts on the Bitcoin blockchain, and tools were created so that those receipts could be put together into a Genesis block, and people downloaded those tools. So following the organizing principle of decentralization, many people around the world constructed their own Genesis blocks, fired up the Ethereum clients that they downloaded, and watched in amazement as this platform, which embodied a new organizing principle for humanity, reached out with handshakes, peer-to-peer, and organized itself into existence. So I'm going to talk through many different things or aspects of decentralization that all contribute to the power of what we are able to do now. The first and obvious one is open source. If you can get an army of developers around the world, you can do some pretty great things, much greater things than a company with a closed source code base. Anyone can submit issues, pull requests, can fork the project. Code forks are an important element of the system. We agreed early on that forks will keep us honest on the Ethereum project, and they enable others to explore different paths forward. Even platform forks, as we've seen, I think are really valuable. We've seen it in Bitcoin, we've seen it in Ethereum, and it teaches us things. It enables us to explore different things. So we didn't really understand what the word immutability meant until we were instructed. Finally, this is just the first inning. We need so many different projects to explore the solution space. Developers, globally decentralized developers. Our Truffle suite has around 110,000 downloads. In Fura, sort of back-end infrastructural elements, use about 1 billion service requests per day on average. We had a Gartner analyst in the office about 3 weeks ago. He estimated that, I think he was ignoring Bitcoin, he estimated that the IBM Fabric code base was the second largest developer core in the world, and that Ethereum had 30 times more developers. So that is really the only thing that matters, in my opinion, when you're building an ecosystem. Crypto economic incentives. We sold Ether in exchange for Bitcoin in 9,000 plus different transactions, and that enabled many different people to become stakeholders in this ecosystem. So incentivized business and software developers to want to create more value and incentivize transaction processors to build the infrastructure. The ERC20 token standard does the same thing. Because these tokens roughly have the same form, it makes it easier for them to interoperate with other important elements of the ecosystem, and it makes it easy for projects to, again, incentivize business and software developers and early stakeholders to add value to the ecosystem. So it's a tremendous number of positive feedback loops that will grow this ecosystem. It's going to result in the thawing of frozen capital. It already has around the world, where so many people who really can't make an investment in a startup in the legacy infrastructure are able to buy utility or protocol tokens for projects that they care about. And for two people in a dorm room somewhere close to here who are innovators, who would never get an email back from a VC, it enables them to permissionlessly VC themselves. So I'd like to think of blockchain as a next generation database system. It's a database system that we can all trust. We can all trust it because we can all inspect the data and the applications. I've been liking the term veridical over pertaining to the truth to describe trust minimized computing that Ethereum enables. This creates a context in which we can build much more reliable systems. So a rogue system administrator, a corrupt CFO, or a hacker can get into systems and change one of the nodes, but they're not going to be able to affect the whole system unless they change the majority of the nodes. And that's relevant for the public blockchain, and it's also relevant for private permissioned implementations of the same technology. So somewhat early on, we started calling it the world computer. And The Economist helped us out a little bit and called blockchain the trust machine, and that'll be a theme in what we see here today. You go a little faster. So one thing to say about public versus private blockchain is that the public blockchain, with all these positive feedback loops, is a tremendous driver of the technology. There are a bunch of competing private blockchain technologies that are being used by corporations and explored by governments. And my feeling is that the people who are helping those entities build their systems are doing them a bit of a disservice. Ethereum is arguably the most powerful decentralized application platform available, and you can build your systems on a stack that enables private permission blockchain systems. You can also easily port those or build other aspects of your infrastructure using the exact same technology in the public permissionless context. And so if you're a corporation or a government and you decide to stand up a system, you select your stack, you build some expertise in-house, and you build a whole bunch of infrastructural elements on that stack. The minute you have the need for a public blockchain use case, and you're going to, you are going to have to reproduce a lot of that technology, I believe. And so I like to argue that people should be building their private permission systems on Ethereum. So do private enterprise blockchains even make sense? I would argue that an enterprise can be viewed as a set of cooperating and competing actors, entities, departments. They're all feeding from the same budget. And so it really is a complex society. A complex society often has the need for different groups to watch each other. And blockchain presents a tremendous infrastructure for different groups within a company to share sources of truth and to collaborate in a trustful, non-redundant infrastructure. IT business processes. So we in our company Consensus and many other companies around the world are starting to build business processes for corporations and for governments on blockchains. These things basically have access points. We use UPort identity as access. And so we can go into a company and enable them to build their business processes on a blockchain. They can give access to those business processes to their employees. They can give the same access to their vendors and service providers, same access to customers. And this is a much more secure IT infrastructure because every transaction against your infrastructure is strongly cryptographically authenticated and potentially granularly authorized for specific aspects of that business process. And so we're going to see companies build lots of business processes on blockchain. We're going to see them reach out to collaborate with other companies. And in those kinds of situations, that other company may not want to use another company's infrastructure. In that sort of situation, it's very easy to spin up a partner blockchain using the exact same technology. You've got all the access controls in place. And in that way, you can, from the ground up, grassroots, you can build consortia. So consortia formation is hard, usually falls apart. But when you're building a consortium, one use case at a time, starting with two counterparties, you can grow these things organically and make sure they work along the way. So agile consortia development. So if you take this, this notion of veridical computing, building systems that everybody using them can trust, if you add the secure IT infrastructure element, where instead of having IT infrastructure that consists of a bunch of soft assets that are ring-fenced by peripherally secured by firewalls, you realize that all of that is realized on a massively decentralized peer-to-peer network, a system with low barriers to entry. You have an engine for universal disintermediation. So intermediation is a good thing. It's valuable when it reduces friction, when it adds information to situations, when it reduces costs. But intermediaries tend to impose themselves into transactions and work to increase the spread between what they extract and what they add to the transaction. And so I would argue that this technology will enable us to squeeze intermediaries in many situations completely out of transaction flows, or to reduce the size of value that they extract, and that this context is a perfect price discovery mechanism for the value of intermediation. So is blockchain going to be big? Slide got messed up. Internet of Information, that was big. We moved to Web 2.0, mobile social, that was, I don't know, 10, 100x bigger. We are moving towards the Internet of Transactions, Internet of Trusted Transactions. That, I think, is what the first phase of blockchain will represent. I think that's going to be even bigger. And when we get to the Internet of Machines, the Internet of Trusted Transactions between people, corporations, and machines, I think that's going to be enormous. The sharing economy. So these companies are intermediary that extracts a whole lot of value from their advertiser customers, and we are the products. We can implement something like Facebook with a set of actors, people, and companies that are all in different roles in this insided market, that all work together to emerge a set of services. And none of those roles on that system will be overly controlling or overly monetizing. Identity, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, is a foundational aspect of Web 3.0, the decentralized World Wide Web, these end-sided markets on open platforms. Your identity is currently sprayed all across the internet and other places and stored on corporate servers and monetized by corporations. As the Web 3.0 takes hold, we're going to see identity exist essentially on your side of the browser, encrypted or controlled from your side of the browser, encrypted, selectively disclosable in situations that you designate. So if you want to monetize aspects of your identity, or if you want to monetize your attention, you can do so and you'll get paid for that. Similar related idea. Currently the fundamental atomic unit of IT architectures is a siloed information system. It's siloed because of the nature of the database technology on which it's built. Because of the trustful nature and the more secure nature of blockchain systems, we can start to view the fundamental unit of IT architectures as collaborative. We are going to be building systems that serve business sectors, that serve industries, cross-industry systems, value chains and supply chains. And so we are going to move towards a world that is much more fluid, frictionless, and supports deep cooperation and interoperability amongst competitors and amongst entities that would like to cooperate. There are different groups around the world that are forming to facilitate this. We were instrumental in forming the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. It's a group of in excess of 200 members, some of the biggest companies in the world, some startups, some governments. And this group, it was intended to enable us to build an enterprise-friendly version of Ethereum, or specify such a thing. But really excitingly, we're seeing lots of different working groups pop up that essentially exist at the application layer rather than the protocol layer. So we're seeing working groups for banking and insurance and advertising technology and law. And this is one of the places, this is currently the biggest blockchain alliance or grouping in the world, and it's one of the places where we can start building that shared infrastructure. It's another place, the Accounting Blockchain Coalition, that has some excellent companies trying to map out what tokens are, really, and how to account for them. So implications for identity and reputation, implications for people. Identity on the planet is broken. In the developed world, as I indicated, we spray aspects of our identity all around and are not in control of it, and Equifax. In the developing world, it's worse. In the developing world, there are 2 billion people who don't have state-issued ID or financial relationships that they can count on. So for the first time in history, we have a database substrate, blockchain, that is appropriately configured for something like a global identity system. And you wouldn't want to build a centralized global identity system because that would represent too great a prize for patient, well-resourced entities to try to capture. So we've built Uport, a self-sovereign identity system. It enables anybody in the world, soon organizations and devices, but we're starting with people, to establish their own blockchain-based identity, use that identity to log into, but not to interact with, not log into, interact with decentralized applications and soon just normal applications that also speak to the Ethereum blockchain. It enables connectivity to the legacy identity provider infrastructure via something called attestations, or verifiable claims. So once you establish your blockchain-based identity, a government agency, DMV, or an agency that certifies citizenship can lodge an attestation on your blockchain-based identity, indicating that this person who's standing in front of me is the same person is represented on the blockchain, basically. That person is a citizen of Canada, for instance, or can drive legally until January 2020. You can have your banks lodge similar attestations. This person's account is in good standing, has in excess of N dollars. These attestations are really powerful. You can release or use focused information without spraying all of the underlying information around. So if you want to establish that it's legal for you to walk into a bar, you don't need to show somebody a document with your address on it. And so attestations are going to be a wonderful way of keeping our lives more appropriately private. We are launching a pilot, an identity pilot with Zug in Switzerland. So Zug is using our UPort system to give their citizens digital identity and enable them to access government services. Electricity, implications for decentralizing the energy infrastructure. We have a couple of major projects, and we've done some other projects in the past. The electricity industry is decentralizing physically. Cheap photovoltaics and storage, or the recognition that centralized generation, long distance transmission is inefficient, it's brittle, it's vulnerable, has led to the decentralization of that industry. Up until very recently, there was no way for Alice on one side of the street to get paid for sharing some electrons with Bob on the other side of the street. So we are currently running a pilot with one of the largest energy companies in the world, where executives in that company have devices in their homes that are doing exactly that. We have another project called Grid Plus, where we sold a token that enables people to take advantage of electricity deregulation and access wholesale energy prices. So the electricity industry is tiered, deregulated in Texas, and so this mechanism gets rid of an intermediary. The cost is around 10, 11 cents for electricity, and half that cost goes to an intermediary that only provides billing services, and so we are squeezing that out. Speak with regulators around the world, and they're pretty much all very excited about this technology. We built a system, a triple entry accounting system called Balance 3, and it is starting to become available to token launches and soon other kinds of businesses. It's going to enable real-time compliance, or other technologies will enable real-time compliance, but it enables real-time accounting and monitoring. Regulators around the world are going to have dashboards where they can keep up with real-time flows, real-time financial flows in companies, in sectors, in countries, and instead of operating de jure and post facto, they're going to have the ability to watch these flows. They're going to have tools that will enable them to do things like graph theoretic analysis. So who's talking to who's got a lot of rich transactional flow between whom. What's this thing over here that only has a small set of transactions to it? What is this little island? Should this little island be looked at more carefully? So the nature of regulation and compliance is going to change quite dramatically. Regulators are going to have to become tech savvy. They're going to have people on staff that, instead of writing rules, interpreting rules, and enforcing rules, they're going to have to write specifications perhaps, or write test suites. And if you're a bank or if you're a securities firm and you implement software that complies with the test suite, assuming the suite's written properly or well, then you won't be able to be out of compliance intentionally. And you won't be able to fat finger trades. Taking that a step further, what happens in a world, what happens to regulation and compliance, which was designed to protect consumers from third parties custodying their assets? What happens in the world when you can custody your own assets? It's going to take us a while to build effective systems with excellent user experience, but I think that in that sort of world, a lot of regulation falls away. So we built a system. Aaron Wright, professor of law at Cardozo Law School, also a member of Consensus, has built a system called Open Law. There's some outstanding demos on YouTube, so I encourage you to take a look at that. We are now able to build hybrid blockchain-based documents, legally enforceable agreements that are part prose and part programmatic element. These clauses, whether they're prose or whether they're programs, are memorialized on the blockchain, and clauses can be constructed from variables, so you can type in numbers and names. Some of these clauses just set out normal legal terms. Some of these clauses are programs that you can escrow money into. Some of these clauses can take money and pay it out on a regular basis or in response to certain conditions that are met. We're building an adjacent music industry infrastructure called UJO, which enables artists to upload their content and attach usage policies to that content and confer licenses in exchange for instant payment. We're using open law for some of those licensing or usage policies that confer licenses. These documents can be forked in their entirety. Clauses can be forked. We're moving towards creating a decentralized open platform to enable lawyers or people like lawyers to create legally enforceable agreements that they can put out on a marketplace and enable people to pay for and license for usage. So that kind of innovation is going to change the legal industry fairly significantly. It's going to free up lawyers to do higher value things, but it's going to just remove a tremendous amount of the cost from those kinds of activities, enable us all to more fluidly do business. So I think oh, this is good, I'm near the end. Mauritius 2.0, Ethereum Island. The leaders of that island got excited about Ethereum. They got excited about blockchain. They did their homework. They realized that Ethereum was the most capable blockchain system and provided the most flexibility for them. And they invited us to ideate with them about what a blockchain, an Ethereum island would look like. And so we spent some time there, and then we spent some time beyond when we went back home, thinking about all the different things that we can do. And the crux is that we built our societies from technology. The technology, it's not something we're going to throw away, but the foundation of it is inefficient. The foundational elements of our society, identity, reputation, agreements, trust, different kinds of certificates, title, it's all realized in analog or frictional technology. It's realized using pieces of paper and rubber stamps and ink and subjective jurisprudence and force and incarceration. All of those technologies are inefficient. All those technologies introduce delays. All those technologies force clearing and settlement of all the transactions using those technologies to extend over minutes, hours, days, weeks, and months in some cases. And so if you can move all these foundational elements of a society into native digital form, put them on a blockchain, put them in registries, and then if you build layers and layers of functionality on top of those foundational elements of your society, you can move many of those transactions into a nearly frictionless context. You can shrink clearing and settlement of many of those kinds of transactions into the instant of the transaction, or if you want some delays for various reasons, you can build in those delays consciously, but it's still a very fluid, frictionless infrastructure for your society. And so technology development, like interest, compounds. So if you can shrink the time that you have to wait to do the next value creating thing, you're going to have a society that grows much more rapidly. The context of blockchain, as we all know, is global. And so there's no reason in the world why Silicon Valley needs to be the technology hub for the planet, the hub that draws all the money. Quite a few years ago, maybe 20 years ago, Thomas Friedman recognized that the internet was rendering a flatter world, and we've seen that. That happened, and it's still happening. Blockchain, interestingly, in terms of capital formation, in terms of allocation of capital, in terms of how projects can organize themselves and run themselves and reach out across the globe because blockchain is global. I believe that blockchain is making countries flat. You don't need to be in Toronto or Vancouver. You don't need to be in New York or Silicon Valley. And so I think that's going to be a really exciting decentralizing force. So, just as we've done in Zug, and as we're doing in other places, I would love to come back here at some point in the next few years and hear that ETHWaterloo doesn't just designate a conference and hackathon, but also designates the way aspects of societies, of the Kitchener-Waterloo Society operates. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. And actually, Joseph brought up a very good point. I neglected to mention one important thing on the front end, that events like this with 500 people next door don't happen accidentally. There's been a gargantuan effort of volunteers, 10-person organizing team, 50 more volunteers that have really come together to help us put this ETHWaterloo together for the community. So if you can join me in a giant round of applause for all the volunteers like Ian, Sonia, Liam, Kartik, who flew from San Francisco to be with us here today, and so many others that I can't mention. And we were deeply indebted to Consensus, of course, for being the presenting sponsor of this talk. A lot of you weren't with us yesterday during the opening ceremonies at CIGI, but Joseph also delivered a keynote as well. And I'll point out one thing that really blew my mind is in Joseph's mind, this particular city and specifically the institution of the University of Waterloo has had such an impact on the world that he's mentioned that it's systemically more important in his mind than basically most banks and governments. So when he said that, that really blew my mind, and it's food for thought. So with that, our next speaker really doesn't need any introduction, but for the purposes of this crowd, I thought I would mention one more thing. At ETHWaterloo, it's about building the future of decentralized applications, and the #1 rule is no price talk. But just for context, for some of the folks in the crowd who have no idea what Ethereum is, perhaps, Forbes recently named Vitalik top 40 under 40. He's 23. And so Vitalik, in creating and inventing Ethereum, earlier this year, It's actually reached nearly $30 billion in market cap, the actual cryptocurrency related to Ethereum, which is called Ether. But of course, what we're doing next door is all about any number of decentralized applications, not just money. So, to put that in perspective, that's like the private valuations of Airbnb or like an Uber and whatnot. So it gives me great pleasure, and it's a real distinct honor to be introducing Vitalik to you guys. So if you can join me in a standing ovation for Vitalik. Over to you.
Cool. Okay, so what I wanted to do today is start off with a kind of general and, like, not technical in the sense of math, but still technical in the sense of you have to think, introduction to what blockchains are and what are some of the ideas behind blockchains and why blockchains are fundamentally so interesting. So I'll start off with the usual question, what is a blockchain? That you've probably heard answered a bunch of times. And you may have heard some silly answers about blockchains having anything to do with proof of work or blocks being chained together or hashes or things like that. And these are very nice answers to have if you want to know how certain specific blockchains technically work. But there are much more helpful answers if you want to think about what blockchains can do for you. So the one I usually use is I just say, a blockchain is a decentralized computer network with a memory. So definition has two parts. The part on the left, as represented by those 6 computers in low resolution connected to each other by lines, is a computer network, and the right, as represented by a brain, means memory. So these two things together are kind of the fundamental elements of what makes a blockchain be a blockchain. We've had decentralized networks for a while. So BitTorrent for file sharing. I'm sure lots of people have downloaded a file over a torrent network here. Originally, Skype was a fairly decentralized peer-to-peer system. And these days, Microsoft added some notion of supernodes. It's not clear if that's even technically an improvement or not, but they're there now, so it's less decentralized than it was before. Tor, internet anonymization. There's a bunch of smaller examples for various kinds of peer-to-peer messaging. There's things like I2P and so on and so forth. And you have Bitcoin for currency, Namecoin as a form of decentralized DNS, Ethereum as a general purpose state machine. So there's many different kinds of decentralized systems, and they've existed for quite a while, and they all tend to serve a fairly wide variety of purposes. The second category, so the decentralized networks below the line, is not like the first category, the things above the line. And you might want to ask, well, why? What is the fundamental category difference between things below the line and things above the line? The answer is memory. So basically, what is the kind of archetypal use case of memory? Right? Now, if you think about a decentralized messaging system, and we can think of the atmosphere in this room through which the sound waves that I'm speaking to you through, as being a kind of decentralized messaging system. Except it's one that only has a range of maybe 30 meters and maybe a bit more if I scream, but I don't like screaming. So, what properties do decentralized messaging systems need to have? Well, I can send a message, and I can send a message, broadcast it, and a bunch of people receive the message. Now, let's suppose I take a message, and I send the message to one person, hi Joseph, and then I copy that exact message and paste it and send it to someone else, hi Joseph. Now I know none of you are names Joseph, but unfortunately that's how copy and paste works. So, basically, even though sometimes it might not make sense to send the same message to 2 different people, but it's still an operation that's theoretically possible, and if this happens, then nothing technically breaks, nothing bad happens. Another property is, once you send a message, after you've sent the message and after a person receives the message, the system itself can forget the message was ever sent. Now, the sender and the receiver might both want to remember locally that the message was sent and that the message was received, but there's no reason for the network as a whole to remember. And there's no reason for anyone other than the 2 people between which the message was sent and received to remember that or even ever know that the message existed. Unfortunately, money does not work this way. So let's say we had a system where I had 100 digital dollars, and I can speak these $100 to Joseph. Then I can copy these $100, and I can speak the same $100 to William. Now, what do we have here? Well, we have a system that can turn 100 digital dollars into 200 digital dollars. Now, this might seem, great, yay, we can multiply money, this will be a great revenue stream for the Waterloo government. But if money actually worked this way, it would hyperinflate faster than Zimbabwe. So basically, money is the sort of thing where you do not want it to be possible to just copy money and send it to two different people. And this makes money a fundamentally different kind of information from other kinds of information that people send. Now, and the other thing is that, basically, in order for a system of money to exist, it has to have some kind of memory, right? So if right now I have 100 digital dollars and I create two transactions and I broadcast both of these transactions. Now, either of those two transactions are totally valid in isolation, right? So a transaction of me sending $100 to person A is totally valid by itself. A transaction sending $100 from me to person B is totally valid by itself, but the two together are not valid. And so after I send the first transaction, the system needs to somehow remember that I used to have these $100, but now I do not have these $100. And so even though the first transaction was valid, the second transaction is not. So the system has to keep track of how much money people have at some particular point in time. And this process of keeping track is not a process that's just between kind of individual pairs of people, but it's a process that's relevant to the entire community that uses that particular currency. So hence, decentralized computer networks with memory. Now, what are use cases of memory? Now, the kind of very simple one that you can think of that covers a lot of use cases is who did it first. Example one, so who received a coin first? If I have a coin, a digital coin, and I copy this coin and I send this coin to two different people, then those two transactions are both valid individually, they're not valid together, and so you want one of these two transactions to succeed and not the second. Well, which transaction succeeds? Well, logically it has to be the first, because if it was the second, then you would start off sending money to one person, and then later on you would switch, basically the coin would switch ownership from the first receiver to the second, which is not really a good property for money to have. So whoever received the coin first actually has the coin, whoever receives the coin second does not get the coin. Registering a domain. So about 3 years ago in late November 2013, I registered the domain ethereum.org. Not realizing just how many people would end up accessing that domain over the years to come. Now let's suppose, fast forward, it is now October 14th, 2017, and suppose that you are a scammer. And suppose that you decide, well, ethereum.org seems to be a popular domain that a lot of people visit, and so I am also going to register ethereum.org. And I am going to basically create my own website, and on my website I am going to say, look, 30 million more Ether for sale, here, put your credit card info over here. And I'm going to try to get people's credit card info and make a few $1 million. So let's say that you as a scammer try to do this, and you register ethereum.org, make it points to your own website, and put up this website. Well, an individual person who is trying to access ethereum.org, the website, would see in a system without memory, so in a system that worked the way messaging protocols work, you would see these two attempts to register ethereum.org, one of which actually happened 3 years ago, the other of which actually happens today. And you would actually have no idea which one of these actually came first and which one of these you should actually view as being correct. Now, if you have a system that does have a notion of memory, as our existing centralized DNS does, because it has servers and these servers have hard drives and RAM and so forth, then this is totally not a problem, because it remembers the registration already happened, and so the second time you attempt to do the registration fails. So other examples, just entering into a financial contract. There might be cases where he needs to remember when a financial contract was agreed to, which clauses were triggered, like when it was resolved. Accepting versus withdrawing an offer. If I make an offer to trade asset A for asset B, then later on I change my mind, and you accept the offer, but at around the same time you accept the offer, then those are two operations that are not compatible with each other. One of them needs to get into the blockchain first, and the system has to decide between one of these two, and everyone has to agree on which one of these two operations actually did come first. Revoking versus using an authentication key. This is just another interesting use case. So let's suppose that I use some kind of cryptographic key to interact with some kind of services, and let's suppose my key gets stolen. So let's say my computer gets hacked. Well, let's say I make an operation that revokes the key. So I send a signature with the key that basically says, this key has been compromised, it is no longer valid, please do not trust it. And I broadcast it. Well, let's say you as the person who hacked my key, you try to use the key and basically impersonate me. Well, here once again you have a kind of who did it first scenario. Basically, like the service that's being accessed is trying to figure out, well, has this key actually been revoked yet, or has it not yet been revoked? And really, what you want is you want a system that tells you if the key has been revoked, and you want a system that also tells you if the key has not yet been revoked. So you want a system that provides proof of existence, and you want a system that provides proof of any existence of a certain type of message. And the proof of any existence is really the interesting kind of unique assurance that blockchains can often give you. So these are some simple use cases for memory, but as we know in reality, there's thousands more, a lot of which are much more complex than any of these scenarios. So let's take a look at the security of systems like Bitcoin and systems like Ethereum. This is called a blockchain. Now, even though these are circles and not rectangles, they're still blocks. It's all mathematical representation anyway. In reality, blocks don't look like squares or circles at all. And you have these blocks and they form a chain. Of course, in reality, they're not literally linked together. Each one just contains a hash of the previous one. But you can think of it as being a chain. And in a kind of well-functioning, well-running blockchain, generally you have this chain, each block points to the previous one, and new blocks just keep on getting added to the end of the chain. It just keeps on growing at a fairly orderly pace, and everybody is happy. This is the kind of optimal scenario. This is the scenario we want to encourage. This is the scenario we want to maximize. Here is a scenario we want to minimize. This could happen for two reasons. One of them is because of a deliberate attack. The other is just because different computers see different views of the network at the same time, and they might just decide to do different things at the same time without seeing each other's actions. So over here, suppose that it just so happens that you have a block here, and there were two different miners that were trying to create a block on top of the same block. One of them created a block. Before this message was fully broadcasted to the network, a second miner also created a block. Now you have a short-range chain split. So now, okay, so now you have two versions of the blockchain. Let's say this transaction, or this block, contains a transaction that sends $5 or like 5 Bitcoins for myself to Alice. And this transaction sends 5 Bitcoins for myself to Bob. Well, how do we decide which one of these is correct? Well, basically, we wait some time, and eventually someone creates another block. Well, let's say we got very unlucky, and someone created a block on top of here, and someone created a block on top of here at the same time. Well, then we just wait again. And let's say the next time we get lucky, and someone creates a block on top of here. Now this chain is the longer one, and this chain is the one that everyone accepts, and this is the chain that everyone builds on. So you have this kind of nice convergence property. Now, what are the things that are actually ensuring this convergence property? So what are the things that are actually ensuring just all of a blockchain security properties in general? Well, if you think of the applications above the bottom line earlier in the above the dotted line earlier in the presentation, the only thing that they really rely on is cryptography. So you use cryptography, first of all, to hide the content of the messages, so that only one particular recipient can hear the message. And so that is encryption algorithms. And Another one is if you if you want people to know that and securely know that it was actually you who sent the message, then you use digital signatures. So cryptography by itself gives you basically the security guarantees that you want. In a blockchain, though, you cannot do that. Now, cryptography can give you some guarantees. It can give you the guarantees that all the transactions actually were signed by the sender. It can give you guarantees of integrity. So in a particular chain, like you can't just go in and change the contents of the block in the middle because then the hash doesn't match. But there is one type of guarantee that cryptography cannot give you, which is irreversibility. So suppose that you have a purely cryptographic system and blocks were produced, just this one, this one, this one, and then the bottom chain over here, 4 and 5. You have no cryptographic proof that this is going to continue being the longest chain or a chain that everyone recognizes. It's totally possible that the next blocks that everyone produces, people just decide to keep building off of this block and just build these 4 blocks over here. So cryptography by itself does not have any opinion between one of these scenarios and the other. And so in order to achieve the property of irreversibility, we need some other things as well. So there's 2 other components. One of them is economics. So economics adds guarantees about the blockchain's future by basically incentivizing them. So over here, if you create a block that ends up being part of the longest chain, you get a reward, so either 12.5 Bitcoins or 5 Ether in the case of Ethereum. If you create a block which is not on the main chain, then you have to pay some electricity and hardware costs to create the block, but you get no reward. And so this is the worst. And if you don't participate at all, then your reward is 0. So actors in the system have an economic incentive to behave in ways that are kind of pro-social. So this is the idea behind basically introducing economics into the security model of decentralized systems. You can use economic incentives to reward participants in the system who further the system's objectives and penalize participants who harm the system's objectives. Now, this is actually philosophically a very interesting thing, because if you think about where do these incentives come from? Well, the incentives that protect the integrity of the system actually are cryptographic tokens that are themselves defined in the system itself. So incentives defined inside a system are themselves responsible for the system's ongoing perpetuation. In this, in my opinion, this kind of weird feedback loop is actually, one of the kind of 3 things that Satoshi invented that's actually so interesting and powerful. Now, aside from this, we also have this idea of decentralization, which means that you have a large number of computers in the network that are creating blocks, and so no single actor has the ability to kind of shove the entire blockchain to one side or the other. And this adds fault tolerance, and it adds security through basically by requiring a cheating system to solve very hard coordination problems. So cryptography, economics, decentralization, altogether combine into this sort of package of security models that I call cryptoeconomics. So cryptoeconomics has a bunch of applications. Beyond blockchain consensus itself, you can talk about scalable verified computation, you can talk about making blockchains more scalable, you can even talk about things like on-blockchain provably fair lotteries, you can talk about decentralized on-blockchain oracles. There's a bunch of applications of this sort of thing. So one interesting idea in blockchain land is this thing called a smart contract. Now, the idea of a smart contract is, in the narrow sense, it is a program that controls digital assets. In the broad sense, it's an application on a blockchain that accepts transactions and executes those transactions according to certain rules. So Nick Szabo came up with the term smart contracts in 1994, and the analogy that he used was basically talking about vending machines. A vending machine is a device that implements the rules of an agreement and enforces them through physical hardware. So if you think about what are the rules of the agreement, well, the rules are simple. You put $2 in, water comes out. You do not put $2 in, water does not come out. These rules are enforced by a vending machine purely through, in modern days, it's electronic code, but previously it was basically purely physical hardware. So this basically allows you to have some guarantee of security in a way that is very cheap, right? So now, security in vending machines is only a limited kind of security, because if you really wanted to, you could knock the thing down, you could smash it with a sledgehammer, and you get the water out, and you can break the invariant. You do not put $2 in, you sledgehammer it, water still comes out. Now, fortunately, in the digital world, we have cryptography, and the properties of cryptography are much more kind of imbalanced on the side of the defender. Cryptography is a magical world where even individuals are capable of giving themselves enough security to defend even against certain kinds of nation-state actors. Even the government cannot crack messages that you encrypt using RSA or elliptic curve cryptography. So when you have, in this digital world, basically like, it is a world where forts are very powerful and weapons are actually quite weak. And so you could imagine smart contracts running on the blockchain as being basically a digital analog of this, right? You would have a computer program that runs on a blockchain, and the computer program just enforces certain rules. And the rules would basically say, so let's say, in this case, instead of selling bottles of water, we are selling digital domain names that are also on the blockchain. And the rules basically say you have a function called buy, and if into this function called buy you would send 1 ether, then you would automatically transfer ownership of the domain name to the sender of the transaction, and you would say, you could pass the money along to the buyer. If the 1 ether does not come in, then the domain does not come out. So just the same as a vending machine, except there is no opportunity to put in a sledgehammer. Unless, of course, you just break the entire blockchain completely. So, this is kind of the basic idea of what smart contracts can give you, and you can imagine them being used in many different, escrow, insurance, financial agreements, just trade of digital assets, lots of different applications for various different purposes. So, what is Ethereum? Ethereum is a general purpose blockchain. And so basically how Ethereum works for you as a developer is fairly simple conceptually. Step 1, you write code. So you write a piece of code, which is a program. It might look something like this, it might look something like this, and it's a program that's written in a human-readable programming language. That you write the code, compiler compiles the code into a much more compact bytecode. You send a transaction to upload the code to the blockchain. Then when the transaction gets confirmed, so when the transaction gets put into a block, the system generates what's called an address for this smart contract that you are creating. And this address looks something like this. And anyone can send transactions going to this address to interact with your application. Now, in real life, if you're an actual user of a decentralized application, you don't need to personally fiddle with transactions and addresses. There are going to be fairly friendly interfaces, wallets, and so forth that do most of the work for you. But this is basically how it works when, under the hood. Now, what is actually running the thing? Well, a decentralized network made up of 25,000 computers distributed all around the world. So you can see, North America and Canada is fairly well represented. You might see like this particular circle is actually looks like 2 circles. So you got Seattle and Vancouver, or this one you got Seattle and Vancouver in there. This entire thing stretches up into the top side of the Great Lakes. So yay Canada. And you have Europe, Asia. So it really is a globally distributed system, globally distributed network, globally distributed community. How it works for you, the user? Well, every operation on Ethereum is a transaction which is recorded on a public blockchain. And you can check the transaction on an Ethereum client, or there are websites online where you can, like Etherscan, where you can just get the details about any particular transaction. So, this is generally the kinds of properties that public blockchains give you. Anyone can download the chain, anyone can download any part of and verify any particular part of the chain that they want to verify, and anyone can develop applications, build applications, upload them, and use applications that other people are building. And there's a bunch of different tools, so it's fairly open for people to start working with it and developing with it. And lots of people actually have started building very interesting things with this kind of technology, right? So, you have people building just various simple financial applications, whether it's just payments. The whole concept of smart contracts is one that can be used in a very wide variety of contexts: financial contracts, insurance, escrow, trading one kind of asset for another, just registering digital assets, coming up with better ways to secure digital assets, lots and lots of use cases. There are use cases in just making the internet more secure in various ways. So earlier on I mentioned key revocation, and there's a bunch of smaller use cases like that. Just a number of smart contracts give you a platform for just generally giving mechanisms that automatically give payouts when certain different things happen. So it makes it very easy to incentivize various different kinds of behaviors. You can use blockchains to just keep track of information to do with identity, to do with reputations, to do with when products were produced and where they were created, where they've where the supply chain has gone through. So the number of applications is fairly large and fairly broad, and hopefully people at this hackathon will come up with a few new interesting ones that we haven't seen before. Thank you.
Thank you, Vitalik. So just a couple of points of order. There's going to be 2 more talks, and then we're going to have a roundtable with all of the speakers up here, and you guys will have a chance to ask any of the speakers questions about anything you'd like. And we also have sandwiches if anybody's interested, and black market hummus. So, our next speaker. So Dr. Julie Maupin is a senior fellow at CIGI's International Law Research Program. She's also a senior research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law in Heidelberg, Germany. She did her PhD in Switzerland. At CIGI, Julie is contributing to the International Law Research Program's research theme on international economic law. Her research will explore the international law dimensions of the use of blockchain and the underlying technology, of course, Bitcoin. She's particularly interested in international financial transactions, and she will also assess the potential of regulatory frameworks. In addition to her scholarly work, Julie regularly advises international organizations, governments, and businesses, and other NGOs on matters of economic law and policy, with a special emphasis on Africa. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Julie Maupin.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today. Great, so the presentation's up. So my name's Julie. I got into the blockchain space in 2012 when I started passively following Bitcoin while teaching international investment and international trade and international commercial arbitration, things like that, in Duke Law School in the US. And then when I moved to Max Planck in Germany, I had an opportunity to kind of reinvent my research agenda. And I was really fascinated by all of the governance implications in blockchain, obviously which expanded quickly beyond just Bitcoin. And I thought, this would be a great time to start looking into this. So my background is I'm an economist and a lawyer. So everyone basically hates me. But that actually turns out to be a really useful combination of things when you're in the blockchain space, because when you want to think about governance implications, you have to look at the question from the inside, from the question of the economic incentives and the design of the system, which Vitalik was just talking about. And then you also have to ask, how do those incentives impact what we see coming from governments and regulations and their concerns on the outside of the system. So that's what I'm going to try and give you a little bit of insight into today. So first, why do we still need governance in a decentralized, distributed world where the vision is to really empower you and me and everybody around the world to be able to interact autonomously, freely, in accordance with the principles that they hold dear, without being confined by the dictates of societies with which they may not agree. So I'll give you a couple of examples why we need governance. First, because things like frictionless direct global markets are great. This is a screenshot from OpenBazaar. OpenBazaar lets you buy and sell things in a decentralized marketplace without having to go through a central operator like eBay. But murder for hire in dark markets is not so great. And that's also something that you can do if you operate in a world with completely decentralized marketplace structures, where people can contract for whatever they want without any sort of outside strictures. And we actually saw this in the Silk Road case with the dark marketplace Silk Road that was built and run by Ross Ulbricht, because the FBI agents that were trying to trap him essentially basically entrapped him into commissioning their murders using the dark web, and that didn't play out well for him, and he's now serving 2 life sentences in the United States. But those kinds of things happen, and we see them happening on the dark web. There are bad people who want to do bad things, and it's not all roses and cherries out there. So we have to think about that. Most of us don't want to live in a world where somebody could be out there contracting for our murder right now. Other example, micro-scale sustainable investment opportunities are great. Here's a screenshot from a startup that started a couple of years ago called the Sun Exchange. They enabled people who have Bitcoin to invest in sustainable energy production in sub-Saharan Africa. So if you had Bitcoin, you would get a prospectus, and you could put a little bit of money in, and the Bitcoin would be used to purchase German solar technology that would be installed on the roofs of some house or hospital or school in a really sunny place, so that they could generate electricity themselves. And then it was set up so that you would get returns at a pre-specified rate of, I think it was around 10% or something, and they would be automatically paid out to you in Bitcoin. That's a really cool idea. We want to be able to open up financial markets and let people invest in things that they care about all over the world without having to go through all of the hurdles of, well, I'm only allowed to invest in things that are accredited in my country or that I can find out about through financial advisors who are certified in my country, or whatever the case may be. But on the other hand, Ponzi schemes are not so great. And we've also seen a lot of those in the cryptocurrency space. This is a famous one, sort of because it happened just earlier this year. There was a lot of press about this. This OneCoin operation was going around and marketing heavily in places like India. I got a lot of emails from people in Africa. Oh, is this a legitimate thing? Should I invest in this? The answer is no. No, you shouldn't. But it turned out, this wasn't even actually a blockchain. There was no blockchain behind OneCoin, but they were claiming that it was a blockchain, a cryptocurrency, and that it was going to be the one coin that would rule them all, and sort of, take over the world, surpass Bitcoin and Ethereum and everybody else. It didn't happen. They are all, I think most of them, maybe all of them, are also now in pretrial detention, and bank accounts all over the world are being seized to try and recover the funds that they scammed people out of. It was basically a pyramid scheme. So a third example why we still need governance of some kind or regulation. Integrating the unbanked into the global economy is great. And this was actually one of the things that I immediately recognized about Bitcoin when I first started following it in 2012 was, hey, there are these 2 billion unbanked people in the world, and this could potentially be a way of reaching them and hooking them up into the global economy. And there are many companies that are startups have tried doing this or using different kinds of distributed ledger technologies to reach the unbanked. BitPesa was one of the early ones in the space. I've got on the screen there. The idea being, hey, you can send money from a developed Western, Northern, whatever country to sub-Saharan Africa, and you can do it much more cheaply than you can through using the global financial system. So we can get rid of these large remittances fees that people have to pay, and then the money can do a lot more good for the intended recipients. But one thing that's not so great about the idea of putting a bunch of unbanked people, even if you could do it with, despite regulatory barriers, which is problematic at the moment, on such distributed systems, is that having an insufficient tax base to build schools and hospitals in all of these places is not so great. So what you see here on the screen is a screenshot of a study from the South African Revenue Service. So South Africa is a pretty well-developed economy within Africa, much richer than many of its neighbors, but it's incredibly stratified, so that you have people who are really part of the first world, and you have people who are completely in the third world, and they're living side by side. So if you see the relevant number for this purposes of this example is, you see down on the bottom there, you see the 7,411,000. That is the number of taxpayers in South Africa. Does anybody know what the official population of South Africa is? It's about 55 million, 56 million. So 7 million people have to pay for everything that the government has to do for all of the rest. And that's because everybody else exists in the informal economy. So if we integrate these people who are in the informal economy into the global financial system in a way that doesn't take account of tax revenues, then we're not going to be able to build schools and hospitals and roads or even broadband infrastructure for them. So we have to figure that out. That's missing internally in most blockchain systems today. So what I want to propose today is that we think about governance a little bit in a concentric circles kind of a model. So here are a few examples of things that you can think about in concentric circles. You can think about the self as a set of concentric circles. In the center, we have our core self, whatever that means. It's a combination of conscious and unconscious and physical things that make up who we are. We may not be fully aware of all of them, influences, nature, nurture, all of that. Then we have the private self. Then we have the things that we know about ourselves that we don't necessarily share with everyone. And then we have our public self. This is how we present ourselves to the external world. You can also think about politics in a concentric circles kind of a model. This is something I found, just a random image from Google Images search, where someone was conceiving of politics in terms of great thinkers in the center, and then you've got disciples, and then disseminators, and lesser disseminators, the citizens way out here, participating citizens way out here in the light blue, and then you've got the politically inert in the very outer circle. Those are the people who don't engage at all in a meaningful way with politics. You can also think about the Anthropocene as a set of concentric circles. This is one model where the economy is one part of it, society is bigger than the economy, environment is even bigger than society, and we're all living in this sort of set of interwoven relationships. You can think about IT environments in concentric circles as well. This is often modeled as stacks, but you can also model it as a set of circles, where you've got in the center there, on the outside you've got the network, then you've got hardware, then you've got operating systems, then apps, and then other stuff, interfaces and things on the inside. But what would this look like for the blockchain world? So my proposal is that actually we would want to set up the concentric circles, or we should think about the concentric circles in exactly the flip model from this IT environments way. So instead of having the network on the outside, we have kind of the protocol at the center, the underlying protocol. And so there's not really a good visual representation for this, and I'm not terribly artsy. So these are a couple of ideas. The one on the left, you can see we've got these concentric circles with these different things. And you notice that the way, I like this image because the way that it's drawn, it sort of looks like, on the one hand, it's just a set of concentric circles, but on the other hand, it's kind of like an Escher drawing. On the other hand, it looks like they're interspiraling with one another in some way. Or if you look at the one on the right, they're sort of overlapping with one another. There are a bunch of different, maybe blockchains with different sets of things built on top of them that are smashed together or touching each other in different ways. And I think that that's the world that we see today and the world that we see developing. And then the question is, what does that look like? What kind of governance structure does that give us? So basically, we have three key types of governance that we have to think about in the blockchain space. One is internal governance. What does the set of incentives and the security decisions and the various different design features that we've built into the system, what results does that render in terms of human behavior in interacting with the system? That's the inbuilt governance of the system, and those are very much, I can't stress this enough, design decisions. So either you choose to set it up that way, or your system ends up operating in a particular way because you didn't think about it. What your design decision would be. So one of the classic examples of this would be, Bitcoin. The original idea for Bitcoin was for it to be completely decentralized and be this really awesome peer-to-peer thing. But it turns out, because of the way that the mining process works in Bitcoin, we see this massive trend towards centralization of mining, with 80% of mining in the hands of 4 mining pools, which are located in China. And that's a massive amount of power to have, because the miners get to determine what happens, which protocol changes are going to be accepted. They play a major role in forks, all of that kind of stuff. And those are governance questions. Should we change the size of the block? Should we make it faster? Should we change the fees? Those are governance questions. And it turns out that actually a centralized set of actors are getting to make those decisions because of the inbuilt incentives in the system. Externally, then, when you have things like that happening, so then that raises a bunch of external questions. So in that specific example, what should we, as the rest of the world, make of the fact that we've got this system for transferring value all over the world, 80% of which is being done in China by these 4 sets of centralized pooled actors? Well, that raises a lot of questions in a lot of minds, because China's not the most free speech, sort of uncensorship, internet, yay place that we know in the world. A lot of implications about what would happen if the Chinese government decides that it's going to crack down on some of these things. But also, even if that weren't the case, just the fact that there is this set of people who gets to make decisions on the basis of, on some opaque basis that most people don't understand, which will then affect how everyone else around the rest of the world gets to use it. It's not a terribly democratic idea, and it's not a terribly decentralized idea. So then we have governance at the interstices. So if you look at the concentric circles, at each interface, the private and the public, say, you've got this governance at the interstices. So I'm also a lawyer, as I mentioned, and in the law we have sort of public law. In continental Europe, they split it into private and public law. Let's just call it law, state law. So law that is made by states, which in a good system, we elect our representatives and they make the laws for us and we all abide by them. And if we don't like them, we just replace them with new representatives and they change the laws. So we've got the law that we as a society have agreed to abide by. And then within that, there's this big wiggle room, which we call private ordering in law. And that is the sphere where you can contract freely to do whatever you want within certain bounds. So you can sell your bicycle, you can sell your house, you can decide who you want to marry, you can make decisions about your children, all kinds of things. But when you run up against the boundaries of the private ordering concentric circle with the public ordering one, that's when you start to get interactions. So for example, you can have a child, but you can't sell it as a slave. You can build a marketplace to buy and sell things, but you can't use that to finance terrorism. Those kinds of things. So there are borders which we draw around what the permitted area of free human activity, independent of state interference is, and that's the interface between private ordering and public ordering. And the way that we set up our blockchain incentive systems also determines how governments then have to react from the outside. So a couple of examples of this. I don't have slides for this, so I'm just going to run through these kind of verbally. So a couple of examples for this. One really notorious example that was super fun to watch last year was the DAO. The DAO was this decentralized set of, well, basically a decentralized autonomous organization, some smart contracts that enabled people to contribute Ether, and then in return get DAO tokens, which would allow them to vote as if they were sort of mini venture capitalists on new projects to fund to be built on top of the Ethereum blockchain. Well, this is a really cool idea because venture capital is not very accessible. It's not something that most people can participate in, and it's heavily regulated in a lot of countries. Many places you have to be an accredited investor in order to be able to invest in certain types of investments, which means basically you have to be really wealthy already. So that means that the people who are able to invest in the most exciting things that could potentially make huge returns are people who are already wealthy. And the people who would stand to benefit the most from it, they're prohibited from investing in it. So this was a cool idea. Let's democratize sort of angel investing or venture capital investing by building this. It turned out that there was a bug in the code and a hacker found it. They raised $150 million-ish and then lost about $50 million to the hacker. This was a really great set of lessons learned for the entire Ethereum community. But actually, the thing that I want to point out about this is not just, what's important about this is not that there was a bug in the code. That's going to happen many times, and yes, people should audit their code better, and I think a lot of lessons were learned there and have been internalized. But what's also important about the DAO is that it was a blessing in disguise that it blew up. because the internal governance structure of the DAO was really not well thought through. And if you looked at the proposals that were coming into the DAO for the things that should get funded by this group of people who had all put in, they were terrible ideas for the most part. And the voting mechanism with which people would vote which projects should be funded was also not very good. And it was based on a really naive assumption that the wisdom of the crowd will pick the winners. Now, why do I call that a naive assumption? Well, because it turns out that there's a lot of research about the wisdom of the crowd and the circumstances in which the wisdom of the crowd is actually wiser than people with professional judgment like venture capitalists. And it turns out that the wisdom of the crowd does not work at all in homogeneous communities. Because if you don't have enough diverse perspectives in the room, you're not going to get all the critical voices that you need to make a wise collective decision. And if there ever was a case for a homogeneous community, it's the cryptocurrency community, right? I mean, even just sitting at the opening ceremonies yesterday, looking around and just thinking, how many women are in this room? How many women are participating in this hackathon? We can look around the room today and do the same thing. So there are really serious problems with diversity, and wisdom of the crowd doesn't function. So you have to think about that, not only in the case of the DAO, but also prediction markets and other experiments that are running on various blockchains. So another example that I wanted to give for you. So recently this year I was asked to do a really interesting project, which was to develop a legal roadmap for the government of Georgia's attempt to put its property registry on a blockchain. So Georgia entered into a cooperation with a blockchain firm called Bitfury, which is mainly a Bitcoin mining firm that has operations in Georgia. And they decided, hey, you know, we have a lot of problems in the past. We had a lot of problems with corruption in the land registration process, where people would sell their land, and in this sort of post-communist transition environment where a lot of stuff was being privatized in a willy-nilly fashion, there was a lot of corruption. So they wanted to say, hey, we're going to clean up the corruption. And they created this National Association of Public Registries, and the NAPR's job is to register, among other things, property transactions, and to do it in a transparent and publicly accountable way. So they created a centralized database to do this, where everyone can view all the records, and they also wanted to make it so that they were keeping themselves accountable by forcing themselves not to be able to change the records after the fact. So the parties come to the registry, they sell the land from Alice to Bob, and then they go away with the title in hand and the money changes hands, but then later on, somebody goes back in and changes the registry, and now it doesn't belong to Alice or Bob, but to Charlie, because of some corrupt action, which doesn't get discovered until years later when the property gets sold for development to some multinational business. So this happens a lot in a lot of countries, and they wanted to make that impossible. So they thought, well, we're going to hash all of the records that we put into the NAPR database onto the Bitcoin blockchain. So you're going to put all the information that you need about the property and the owners and all of that. You make a hash of it, you put it on the blockchain, and then anyone who wants to can go and look up that hash and verify that it matches what's in the NAPR's registry, so that you know that it hasn't been tampered with. That was phase one. Phase two, which they were asking for some legal advice on. Phase two was, so how can we now make it possible to allow the parties to actually do the smart contract, to use a smart contract for the sale of the property, so that instead of having to write out a contract, I can just write a smart contract, we can do it all over whatever blockchain, and it will automatically then enter the government registry and change the record. So it turns out when you start opening up this onion, you unpeel many, many, many layers of legal complexity. So for example, what do you do about legally, how do you determine legal incompetence? So you have two people who are interacting over a blockchain. They don't come in person to have their identity verified. Maybe we can use a solution like Uport, or one of the other many solutions that are out there for a blockchain identity. Self-sovereign identity does solve a lot of those problems for us, and it's very exciting. But even if you can do that, you need to make sure that it's not just who am I dealing with, but also has this person been declared legally incompetent by a court? Is this person under a mental disability? Is this person a minor? Is this person got a legally appointed custodian because they have a drug or alcohol problem right now? All these kinds of things, and those bits of information don't reside with the public register of property. They reside with other public registers all throughout the Republic of Georgia, and you have to make those different types of things talk to each other. You can do this if you get them all to use self-sovereign identity types of structures. But you have to make sure that everybody does it once. You can't just have the property register do it by itself. It won't work. And then what about people with disabilities who actually just can't interface with a smart contract? They need to be able to designate someone else who can do it for them. And then you need to be able to check that the designation was valid. Another level of complexity. Then there was this interesting question about, well, who should write the smart contracts? And if you write a smart contract, are you then an intermediary of some kind? Because if you look at the civil code or the laws of a lot of countries, you'll see that we actually place legal duties on intermediaries, people who help with sales in between people for consumer protection reasons. So if you screw up the contract and you write it in a bad way, you could actually be legally liable for it. And if the government, and Joseph, you mentioned this in your talk, if the government itself writes the contract in some way, the government itself could be legally liable. So you have to look at that, and you have to think about the fact that maybe we can have an army of lawyers out there who are super creative, geek lawyers who are going to be able to create template clauses and template contracts on a marketplace, like what Aaron Wright is doing with open law. But they might be liable then if they screw up. And it might not actually be this sort of decentralized marketplace of lawyers. It might be AI bots, because there are other startups that are focusing on that right now, so that you just, when you want to write a smart contract, you get a little chat that pops up, and it walks you through the process and asks you a few questions, and it creates a contract for you on the basis of machine learning. So then you don't have a human to hold liable, you have a bot to hold liable. So there are a lot of different really complex questions because of the way that we set up the internal system. And then if we think about, for a third and final example, there are a lot of governments that are talking about issuing fiat currencies, essentially, government-backed currencies on a blockchain. And this raises a lot of interesting questions as well about competitions between truly stateless, as permissionless, public blockchains like Ethereum, and state-centralized models. And this touches also on what Joseph was saying about public and private chains and consortium chains. A lot of those themes come up again in this context. But basically what we have is we have three different possibilities out there, or major possibilities. The first one is you put what we currently have today, which is a fractional reserve banking system, on a blockchain. And the government issues the money in accordance with whatever monetary policy it uses, and then it goes in this multiplier way through the banking system and multiplies credit. And this would be really an interesting experiment, because we don't really know a lot as economists about monetary policy today and how well it works, because it's pretty opaque. We know what the government does at the beginning of the process, but we don't really know what happens to the money as it gets multiplied through the shadow banking system. Except that once in a while we get a little window of illumination when some kind of financial crisis hits, like the subprime loan crisis or the Greek debt crisis. Then we see, oops, this was piling up money in this one part of the economy that we weren't aware of somehow. If you had all of that on a blockchain, you could actually see all of that data in real time, and assuming you could find a way to meaningfully mine it and analyze it, you could probably make a lot better decisions about monetary policy. But there are probably a lot of people in the existing financial system who really don't want that information to be known, because it would illuminate not only where the money is going, but who is profiting most from monetary policy. And it might not be Main Street, but Wall Street. So that is a politically hot question, and something that's definitely worth thinking about and experimenting with. So the second option that we have out there now, thanks to blockchain, is that you can have a pre-announced monetary policy. And this can be done either in a state-launched or a non-state launched blockchain. Bitcoin did this, obviously. They said this is the number of Bitcoins that are ever going to be in existence. Then everybody knows what they're going to get. This is how many will be created. This is how often they'll be created. It's an announced monetary policy. There's some room for playing at the margins, but basically that's it, the 21 million Bitcoins, and then it's done. It's a deflationary monetary policy. It's rigid, though, and you can't change it if you later discover that actually that's hindering innovation or what you can do using that currency. So then you have the third, which is an unannounced monetary policy. which is essentially what we have in Ethereum. So we have a monetary policy which we don't really know exactly according to what schedule and in what kind of decisions will be made about the monetary policy of the underlying tokens. And that's problematic because it makes it difficult to plan for people who want to know what is going to be the value of the currency in the future, what am I going to be able to do with it, how often will it enter circulation and at what levels, etc. Is that monetary policy going to have any relationship to the real growth of the economy? Is there some kind of inflation targeting or something like that? We don't know. So, and it's also troubling from the outside user's perspective because it puts the users of that monetary system at the mercy of whoever gets to make those monetary policy decisions, just like in the case of central banks. So, except obviously they're not central banks, they're developers and maybe miners, maybe stakers who are making those kinds of decisions in the future. But the question is, which of these three models then is the better one from a governance perspective for society? Is it better to have this opaque, fractional reserve, state-centered banking system? Or would we rather have this known, stable, this is what you get, Bitcoin kind of system? Or do we want something that's more flexible but unpredictable because it's unannounced? And my answer is, we don't know, but we should try to find out. So it would be great to see, I'm thrilled that we're seeing these experiments happening side by side, and I think it's going to be really fantastic in the next few years to see who the winners and losers are. One thing we know for sure is that we're going to have a whole lot more data to look at, and that's going to be helpful. So those are three quick examples. There are a lot more questions one could ask about this interface between internal design and what that means in terms of external governance, but we will save some chances to have questions in the panel as well. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you, Julie. And next up for a short 10-minute talk before the panel, we have William Mougayar. William is an author of The Business Blockchain. He's a producer of Token Summit, and he's also a venture investor and advisor. In fact, when I first met William, I was a director at Communitech here in town, and he was coming to town to check out some velocity companies, and we actually have Communitech CEO here with us today, Ian Klugman, my old boss 2 careers ago. But in any case, he's also the founder of Startup Management. He's a mentor, an entrepreneur, a speaker, and definitely a thought leader when it comes to blockchain. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce William to you, who will take it over.
Thanks very much, Nabil. So let me start by asking you a very simple question. Now that you've been listening to Ethereum for a while, what do you think is the most important feature about Ethereum? Okay, well, this is a trick question, really, because the most important feature about Ethereum is not a feature. The most important feature about Ethereum is the title of my talk. It's the Ethereum ecosystem. And to give you an appreciation of this ecosystem, I wanted to take you back in history a little bit, because I could probably qualify as the unofficial Ethereum historian, having seen the birth of Ethereum from the very early days and watched them and helped them very closely. So this whole thing started when Vitalik, 4 years ago, wrote the white paper. Then he announced it in Miami in January of 2014. Then they did the sale, a few lines of code, generated the tokens. They sold 48 million ETH, the currency that we know about today. Then they had the first developers meeting in Berlin. There were barely 30 people in there. That's really what started Ethereum. 2 years ago, again, to put things in perspective, I've been tracking the space for more than 4 years, and as my role as an analyst, I analyze what's going on. 2 years ago, 80% of the activity in the ecosystem was Bitcoin. 2 years ago, when we were in London with Joseph and Vitalik at the DEF CON 1, I had just developed this landscape of all of the companies in the blockchain space in the financial services industry, 300 companies. And we were so happy to see just a few Ethereum logos at the time. And we were saying, well, yeah, Ethereum is penetrating the ecosystem. What a difference 2 years can make. Now, the Ethereum system is strong and big. It's developers, startups, meetups, hackathons, enterprises, funds, governments, banks, crypto capital, everybody is using Ethereum. To be specific, 50,000 developers today, and this is a conservative figure, to give you a relative measure of that number. Today, next door, there are close to 400 developers here. That means for every one developer, there are 125 others somewhere in the world that know or are playing or working with and touching the Ethereum technology. That is significant. 63% of central banks are working with Ethereum technology today, according to a recent survey. And that's 75% of those that are doing anything with blockchain. 44% of public institutions are working on Ethereum technology today, and that's 90% of all the ones that are doing anything with blockchain technology. More than 300 enterprises are very seriously developing Ethereum projects, solutions, and various applications. As Joseph mentioned, the Ethereum Enterprise Alliance on its own has more than 200 companies in it. And it's the who's who from the big companies to the small startups. More than 730 Dapps, decentralized applications, are tracked on this website that Consensus has founded, State of the Apps, the Dapps. You can go and search on any tag, anything that you are thinking about. There's probably an Ethereum application being developed today. More than 1,500 startups. And every week, there's probably 10 or 20 new ones that are emerging. I get emails every day of new companies that are working on Ethereum technology. More than $1.5 billion of capital raised in the last 12 to 18 months only. That's 80% of the whole total of crypto capital that has gone into blockchain-related startups. VC is the new VC. Virtual currency is the new venture capital. And Ethereum is really leading it. We cannot talk about Ethereum without comparing it to Bitcoin, because it's all part of the same big ecosystem. And just to put things in perspective, 4 years ago, Bitcoin was 4 years old. And the total value market cap of Bitcoin was $1 billion. Today, Ethereum is 4 years old, and its market cap is $30 billion. That gives you a relative sense as to how much quicker the Ethereum technology is propagating into our world, into our society, into our government, into our business, into our lives. You can extrapolate. Today, Bitcoin is about $100 billion, so 100 times more than it was 4 years ago. And if Ethereum continues on the same trajectory, it might be worth $3 trillion in the near future. So Ethereum is really the cool thing here, right? So if Ethereum was a car, I make this analogy, what kind of car do you think Ethereum would be if it was the coolest car around today? Tesla, right? Tesla. This is how Ethereum sees itself. This is how Ethereum sees Bitcoin. This is how Bitcoin sees Ethereum, because they keep criticizing it, but they're not right. So where are we? Let's be serious here. When technology develops, usually there are 3 types of buckets in terms of the activity. And first, we have to build the infrastructure. Then a bunch of middleware software gets built on top of the infrastructure. And then smart developers use the middleware to develop applications that require the infrastructure. So you can think of the Ethereum blockchain as really that base layer infrastructure. And where are we today? This is my own estimation. I think we're about 70% into the infrastructure, about 50% into the middleware, which means that we need to see more and more middleware, which is very important because that makes things much easier for developers. And we're only 20% into the applications segment. I've lost a bit of volume. You probably know about that sound. Okay, I was too loud. No problem. The ecosystem today is very rich. You just name any particular segment, and there are dozens and dozens of projects and solutions in each one of them, from the core technologies, which the Ethereum Foundation is focused on, to all kinds of development tools, languages. You name a language, software language, there is in Ethereum. You can build Ethereum applications on it. You name a client, there's a version of it that Ethereum supports. You name an industry, and there are at least a dozen Ethereum applications currently being worked on. Professional services, fund management, accelerators, all other protocols that are going on top of Ethereum. The ecosystem is big and it is very rich. Where are we in terms of the evolution? If you think about 3 or 4 years ago when Vitalik started and it was all about selling the vision and he wasn't alone, then a whole bunch of people followed him to sell the vision, and then at the top end is when the vision gets realized. We are probably today in the installation phase of this evolution. And this is only the beginning, because the big part is going to happen when the deployment phase starts next year. A lot of the applications today are in the early stages. Ethereum is the new Java, and I make this analogy because it's very important to remember that Java was really what started the web. Java was this neutral language that if you wrote an application once on Java, then you can run it many times on the web. You don't have to worry about what kind of server it ran on. And today there are about 10 million Java developers, but we don't have enough Ethereum developers. So you have on one hand 50,000, and the other hand you have 10 million. It tells you where we have to go. So maybe Ethereum is not a Tesla, maybe Ethereum is a very modern train that is pulling ahead the ecosystem behind it. Let's look forward to a day where there are thousands and thousands of applications with millions and millions of users on Ethereum, and this is where we're going. And maybe it might happen faster than we think things can happen, because the last 2 years were phenomenal. We didn't forecast it was going to happen so quickly. But let's be realistic as well. Ethereum is not perfect today, but there are no blockchains that are perfect today. Don't let anyone tell you there is a perfect blockchain. It doesn't exist yet. So yes, Ethereum is not perfect yet, but many of its parts are excellent. Thank you. So now we're going to jump into the panel discussion. If I could ask Vitalik and Joseph and Julie to join me. And I was told to take the rooster seat. I don't know if there is a meaning behind that. Let's find out. Okay. Questions for the panel. We're going to do a few minutes of questions, and then we're going to take some questions from the audience fairly quickly.
Okay.
So maybe start with a question directed at Vitalik and Joseph as a starting point. It was what are the things that the blockchain is not good at? Because I think one of the traps is that people want to put everything on the blockchain. And I think both of you have a lot of experience now, and you're seeing things that should not be on the blockchain. And that, in a way, helps people to get to the real, more important things that should be on the blockchain.
And I would say, can people hear me, by the way? Wow. So first of all, the main 3 weaknesses of a blockchain are, number 1, scalability, and this is felt by application developers and users in the form of transaction costs. Number 2, privacy. So all data on a blockchain by itself is public. And number 3, latency. So you have to wait for, in Ethereum's case, like 14 seconds for a confirmation, as opposed to a centralized service where you can wait half a second. So if you have anything in an application where either you want to get instant feedback, or the use case is not one that's valuable enough to pay transaction fees, or there's just too much data involved to pay the transaction fees to put all of it on the chain, or it's data that needs to be public, then chances are you do not want to be putting that data on a blockchain. And chances are either it's an application that, at least at this point, doesn't make sense to put on a blockchain, or it's a sort of application that makes sense to you where you want to use a blockchain, but you want to use a blockchain in a more kind of complex and nuanced way than just shoving the entire application on it.
Yep. Can you hear me? Is this on? It's on, cool. So with respect to data storage, scalability, you certainly don't want to put a lot of data on public blockchain right now. It's too expensive, but as the Ethereum roadmap begins to be realized with respect to scalability, we're going to see a bunch of different mechanisms that enable transactional throughput to grow dramatically, essentially to infinite transactions per second. Currently, if you add compute to the Ethereum blockchain, you increase overhead just a little bit and you reduce transaction per second throughput. But if you can add compute to the blockchain in the form of functional units called shards, then you can keep adding more and more compute and get perhaps a quasi-linear increase in transactional throughput. All of that is going to move us into a world where transactions get very, very inexpensive, I believe. Storage technologies will enable decentralized storage to get very, very inexpensive. So I think we'll still see specialized decentralized storage having a role as bulky data storage, but I think we'll see more and more data on the blockchain itself. With respect to privacy and confidentiality, there are technologies being built into Ethereum currently that will help with privacy, and there are overlay systems that enable subsets of actors on the system to engage in confidential transactions that are part of the overall consensus of the system, but aren't readable by actors that shouldn't be able to read them.
Great. Julie, I was going to get you because you mentioned the Open Bazaar in your remarks as one of the examples. I'm not sure if this was a good or bad. You know, I'm an investor in Open Bazaar. I'm on the board. So can you clarify what was the example about and what could be done better?
No, actually, I mean, the Open Bazaar thing was just an example of that the title was, direct peer-to-peer markets are great, but being able to do things like murder for hire in direct markets are not great. I don't think we see that in Open Bazaar, so it's not really particularly directed at that remark or at that particular startup. But the bigger idea is simply that we have to have ways of distinguishing which uses of blockchain technology are being built, designed in ways and used in ways which further broadly shared societal goals and which ones aren't, or in which instances they're not. So building systems in a way that, that makes it possible to do anything at any time without any kind of detection, with no consequences, is probably not at the end of the day what we want, because there are some things for which we want to hold one another accountable as a society, and that's why we have political consensus. Political consensus might be determined in completely radically new ways using blockchain technologies. There's no reason necessarily that it always has to remain the domain of the nation state, but there has to be nevertheless some kind of consensus about what kind of a world we want to live in, and those decisions need to be built into the systems that we're designing.
Are there any good examples where governance is being done right on the blockchain?
Governance being, sorry?
Being done right, governance is well integrated into blockchain that you can think of.
Yeah, there are lots of examples of that. Right now, the sticking point is that people who are trying to build governance into their projects are nevertheless running up against outside regulatory barriers because they're doing it in ways that are new or unusual for external regulators. A great example is the case of remittances and the companies that are trying to work on providing free or very low-cost remittances to people in the developing world who really can't afford to have even 7% of the transaction or 3% of the transaction eaten up along the way. So that's something that's really difficult to do, because at the end, when it gets to the receiver's side, you have to somehow be able to know that the people who are receiving the money aren't, they're not on any anti-money laundering watch lists, they're not on any counterterrorism financing watch lists, etc. Because in principle, one could do many, many, many of these tiny little transactions and make it look like remittances and actually be funding global jihad. So you have to have ways of doing that. Now the question is, do we have to do it in the way that we've always done it before? And regulators like the things that they know and not the things that they don't. But the purpose of the regulation, AML KYC regulation, is to prohibit these kinds of activities. It's not doing it perfectly in the global financial system that we have today. So I think that building new systems of governance directly into whether platforms or Dapps on top of platforms, you have to then interface with governments and regulators and say, look, we are fulfilling your policy goal by doing this. And we're just doing it in a way that looks different than what you're used to. But we can fulfill your policy goal at least as well as your existing regulatory system. For example, if you could show that you have a remittances service that is not being used at more than greater than 3% for money laundering, so that it doesn't exceed what we see in the traditional system, then fine, we should allow it.
Great. Joseph, back to you. You're at the forefront there, implementing, you're doing the hard work. I mean, the foundation and other developers, they throw the technology over the wall, you put it together, it's not perfect, and you make it work. What are some really interesting projects that you're seeing that we can expect to see a lot of users coming into it in the next 6 months, let's say? Can you comment?
Well, I spoke of a few of them. Decentralized self-sovereign identity is incredibly important. It'll be the foundation of the decentralized World Wide Web, and there are many vectors that we are applying to push that out into the world. A couple of fun projects that I think will gain traction pretty soon. One is the UJO system. UJO Music is the first instance of it. We are enabling artists to register their content using open law to attach usage policies to enable consumers or other artists to get public performance licenses or derivative works licenses or synchronization licenses. In contrast to the way the music industry works, value will be sent in and exchanged for licenses instantly. The artist itself who's registered his or her content will have the ability to designate collaborators so that that payment gets immediately split and all of the content creators will be paid instantly. We're building, on top of this content management infrastructure, we're building a business and social network. So we're already selling albums on the system, and we're enabling artists to register their content or to register themselves as bands, etc. very, very soon. One fun project that is moving into token launch pretty soon is called Virtue Poker. So I think this has a chance. It's provably fair poker. It's a poker system that will enable people who are using the system to only have their funds at risk when they're actually playing the game. So in contrast to the current online poker industry, where you have to go through quite a lot of gyrations to get funds onto the system, and because it's such a pain in the butt, you leave your money there, and governments shut those systems down, and service providers walk away with those funds in different circumstances. In this situation, we've drastically reduced the risks of that.
So is this going to be legal? Is this kind of the loophole for making it legal?
In many places it will be legal, yeah, absolutely, and we won't offer it in other places. And the interesting thing about that is that the online professional poker players, 3 of the top 10 all-time money-winning players are helping us build the system, will promote the system, and are extremely excited to get all of their friends into the system because they hate the way the online poker industry works. So, there's a chance that that will get some real traction. Great.
Back to Vitalik. I want to talk about Ethereum and the society. Because what struck me about Ethereum when I first heard it from you is that, and I said in the book, I said I saw a human element to it. It's not just technology, it's a human element. And then you think a lot about technology. Can you tell us, like, what's your philosophy now about the Ethereum's impact on society? Where is it going?
This kind of question is often a very difficult one to answer, especially for general purpose technologies, because like it's similar to asking, look, what impact does C++ have on the programming language have on society? Like the problem is that the thing is just so generic that like it's literally probably the same programming language that gets used by people building the dark markets and also gets used by the police trying to catch them. So it's blockchains aren't quite as far because unlike programming languages, they do also have like very specific properties like decentralization, like like openness, this idea of reducing and disintermediating trust, and those are very particular directions, and they do enable certain specific kinds of things that aren't that like previous generations of technology didn't enable. Although you could argue that they weren't they were enabled in somewhat different forms. So the fact is the internet did democratize the ability to publish things that in order to become visible to much larger audiences. Like social media did this democratize the ability to easily talk to people on the other side of the world. And I do see blockchains as democratizing the ability to, in simplest terms, make agreements. And though at the same time, the kinds of agreements that people can make, the kinds of assets that people can create and store, the kinds of smart contracts that people can build are many and varied. And ultimately, it is basically up to humanity to decide what it ends up building on top of these platforms.
Can I jump in?
Yes.
Yeah, so I see Ethereum as one of a suite of decentralizing technologies. It's perhaps the linchpin or the glue. These technologies include decentralized storage, trustful computing or trust minimized computing for Ethereum, high throughput computing organized in a decentralized way, similar things for bandwidth. All of these mechanisms need to come together to build the next generation, the decentralized World Wide Web. That's going to enable us as a global society to move from top-down command and control as an organizing principle to richly, rapidly communicating, consensus-forming set of overlapping global villages that are all focused on specific topics, that are able to define their goals, fund their goals, execute their goals, all in a decentralized fashion.
So are the smart contracts the window to this? Or is it going to be available to consumers? I'm always looking for ways to put this technology in the hands of consumers. And it could be that smart contracts are going to be in the hands of lawyers. We haven't seen that yet.
From a purely theoretical standpoint, creating your own smart contract is only 5 minutes and 75 cents away. But from a much more practical standpoint, right now it still does take quite a bit of expertise to actually create one of these contracts, particularly in a way that is secure. And I think we are going to see a wide variety of tools for wide varieties of professions and wide varieties of skill levels start to be developed. Especially over the next couple of years, both as the fundamental technology needed to actually build smart contracts increases, and as the applications built on top of them get more and more infrastructure and get closer and closer to actual mainstream adoption.
Yeah, so we've done a bunch of supply chain management work around the world. The public instance of that is work we did with BHP Billiton. We've taken those different projects, we've abstracted them, generalized them into a product called Viant. Viant is a business process flow or supply chain management system. You can define assets, actors, states, transitions, very elegant user interface, and it writes the smart contracts for you, and it puts the user interface together for you. We can show you a demo at some point soon. And at this level already, analysts in organizations can wire up their supply chains. We're moving that beyond. We're going to create domain-specific languages so that analysts in specific industries can more easily construct these things, domain-specific, and eventually move them into a sort of puzzle pieces sort of interface so that you can just graphically wire up supply chains.
Great.
So I think, you know, as the user interfaces get more sophisticated, you won't need to write smart contracts.
I'm looking forward to that. Julie, you wanted to add something about smart contracts, and what's your viewpoint there about the prospects in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think as the tools continue to improve to become more user-friendly, which they're not anywhere near where they need to be yet, that will become more and more possible for more people to start interfacing with them. I mean, if I look at the way that my 10-year-old is learning, you know, coding, starting with Scratch, you know, which is a program, software that was developed by MIT, and it's kind of a plug and play, drag and drop, sort of a modular way of learning how to do things, and then you can become more sophisticated from there. Or you can just decide, you know, actually, I really don't like coding, and I want to just have something where I can just click on boxes, because not everyone in the world is going to become a smart contract programmer. We have to be realistic about that. So the user design needs to become a lot better. And I think that in relation to that, we also have to start thinking about consumer protection in a different way, because right now we have this model where we have legal agreements, and online they interface, they show themselves as these I agree buttons that we click, which have hundreds of pages of text which nobody reads. And this was demonstrated last night at the hackathon, when there was an embedded piece of an embedded line in the I agree to the hackathon terms and conditions, in which says if you read this line, you will win a free prize at the hackathon. And only you send us an email, and only 11 people out of the 450 participants actually read it, which I think is really high. I'm impressed that they actually did. But we need to start thinking about different ways of verifying that people know what they're doing when they conclude a smart contract. And we can actually use technology to do that as well. We can ask a set of interactive questions. We can use bots to help walk people through the process. We can use sort of mini quizzes that walk them through the process to make sure that they understand what they're agreeing to, the essential terms, before they click yes and append their digital signature from their sovereign wallet, self-sovereign wallet to it. But we do need to have some kind of mechanisms in place. Otherwise, we're going to end up with all kinds of things that will be scams, you know, massive scams, sort of the digital blockchain-based equivalent of grandma's mutual fund being robbed out from under her. Yeah.
Great.
Let me just jump in quickly. The value of blockchain is so profound and exciting that many people are talking about it. But I think it's really important to note that most of the people in this room will never use blockchain. The software developers in this room will use blockchain, but you're all just going to keep using the World Wide Web, and we're going to build applications for you that enable you to do things better than you've done them before, and enable you to do things that you were never able to do before. So I get sad when people start to worry about everybody needing to get savvy with this software development infrastructure. It's not going to be the case.
That's a good way of putting it. We're going to take questions from the audience. Before doing that, so start thinking about your questions. One more question to Vitalik. Is there anything that surprised you that you can think of in the past 6 months to a year, regarding the development of the whole Ethereum ecosystem, or anything to do with Ethereum?
I mean, definitely just the sheer speed and scale at which it happened is by itself something that I think was very significant and very surprising, especially over the last 12 months.
So much faster?
Much faster.
5x,
much
10x,
larger.
2x?
Also, the large amount of enterprise adoption in the blockchain space is definitely something that has been surprising over probably the last kind of half decade in general. I would say also just the fact that in general we've migrated from blockchains being only interesting for payments to blockchains almost being more interesting for everything but payments. that's also something that I probably would not have predicted back in 2012 or at least early 2013. I mean, I clearly did start seeing it in late 2013 when I started getting into general purpose blockchains as an idea. I'd say those are probably some of the major ones. I mean, as far as just the speed of technological development, I think it's in some ways both slower and faster than what we've been anticipating.
Probably on the scalability side, did you expect to go faster?
Yeah,
maybe?
I think that for Ethereum technology specifically, both on the proof of stake side and the scalability side, the solutions are coming both substantially later than we expected, but are also substantially better than we expected.
That's good.
So that's in some ways bad news for the short term.
That's
but
a very good
probably
answer.
Very good for the long term.
I think a great example of that is the privacy developments as well, because that was something that took me by surprise, because it was very clear early on to everyone who started looking at this that this is going to be a huge issue, how to take care of privacy, and then Zcash coming along and showing how to do this with ZK Snarks and others getting into the space, Monero with ring signatures and whatnot. That was something that I think developed a lot more ideas or made it possible to deploy a lot more things faster than I expected.
Great. I'm tempted to ask you one more question. Are you worried about both, anyone can answer, are you worried about that there's a bit too much token dominance right now in the ecosystem? Tokens, a lot about tokens, and is that worrisome, or you think, because I kind of always remind people it's not just about tokens, there's a lot going on besides just that.
So first of all, it's an established fact that 90% of startups fail. And it should also be an established fact that 90% of these ERC20s on CoinMarketCap are going to go to zero. So it's, this basically is like tokens 1.0. And, there are some good ideas, there are a lot of very bad ideas, and there's a lot of very, very bad ideas and quite a few scams as well. And I expect, I expect that kind of tokens 2.0 and the kinds of things that people will start building in 2018 and 2019 will in generally be substantially higher quality, especially once we start seeing what the consequences of the first wave of tokens are kind of in the medium to longer term. And once it becomes clearer that actually sensible economic valuation models are needed for these tokens to make sense, what is a good role for them, what is a role that doesn't really make sense, do we really need 56,125 different forms of medium of exchange? Maybe not, but we may need 56,125 types of something else. Personally, I am happy that there is a lot of experimentation going on. And one thing that I think is somewhat unfortunate is that I see that there's a lot of the attention is concentrated on a very small number of projects, and I feel just because of the social dynamics of the space are making it easy for a lot of attention to be concentrated on a small number of projects. So, for example, people talk a lot about 3 or 4 projects with $200 million ICOs and so forth, but there is also this very kind of long tail of much smaller projects, and often do very interesting things that we often just never end up hearing about. And I think part of this actually comes from the fact that these tokens don't have sensible valuation models. And basically, if you try to economically model the idea of tokens being valuable as a medium of exchange, you start to realize that it's a very multi-equilibrium game. Basically, because tokens get value if maintain their value if people want to hold them, and if they start looking like they're not going to maintain their value, then they become more expensive to hold, and so they can't maintain their value anymore. And so I feel like this kind of multi-equilibrium element of the economics of the situation actually does encourage this kind of high level of concentration, where there are a few ideas that end up basically kind of becoming getting a large amount of attention, basically purely because there are a small number of people that are kind of at the center of of the social circle, and this leads to all sorts of various consequences, and just another one of which is just people taking random selfies of myself and trying to put that on the website as an endorsement, basically it's like, hey, I took look, here is a picture. I expect that there is in general, when you have a new industry and you have this kind of early stage 1.0 period, lots of people try different things, and lots of people try lots of things that just make no sense whatsoever. And after some time, and the market does mature, and people find kind of the right place for these kinds of things.
Yes.
And I personally do think that it's coming, but there is also there is going to be a process involved in getting there.
I keep reminding people that Ethereum only raised $18 million, 4 of which maybe got disseminated because of fluctuations of exchange. And look what you did with that much money.
Yeah, one particular kind of, I think, important economic challenge in a lot of these systems is also just kind of incentive mismatch, in the sense that incentives for the developers are front-loaded, whereas the benefit of these projects to all of their users and to society is backloaded. In the sense that you actually need to do a whole bunch of work to get that out and get that done, and coming up with incentive models that kind of basically the thing is, right, that when individuals aren't well equipped to really dig down into the technicals of something and understand if it makes sense or not, you have to rely on secondary proxies. And the usual secondary proxies that people rely on are, one very big one is social proof, and another one that you can use is incentive alignment. And incentive alignment basically means, the guys doing the thing do well if and only if I do well. And I think establishing mechanisms that properly have more incentive alignment in between the different parts of participants in a system is something that is generally very important and helpful. Establishing incentive alignment of social proof is also something that's very helpful and valuable. So there's a difference between social proof in the sense of a guy just giving his thumbs up versus social proof in the sense of someone who is really willing to put a large portion of his time into a given project, and distinguishing between those two is important. Yeah.
So putting all this into perspective, we've had tokens for millennia. We've had tokens in the form of beads and pieces of metal and pieces of paper representing money or securities or Beyonce tickets. So with the advent of every new instantiation of token technology, we have the builders, the makers, and we have the crackers or the hackers or the breakers, right? And there's a tug of war there. It's hard to understand all of the edge cases of a new technology. It's much easier to find cracks in that new technology if you think you can achieve some value by providing that sort of unasked for security consulting service, basically. In the legacy world, we have financial instruments, we have things like bucket shops, we have a lot of constructed business models. There's no reason to believe that this new technology should be devoid of that. Often information asymmetries are taken advantage of, and people are hurt by those things. The difference here is that things are moving so fast, things are developing at an exponential pace. The asymmetries, the informational asymmetries in this space are even larger, but interestingly, and the barriers to entry are a lot smaller. So you can just put up a web page, or you can get on somebody's Slack and say, okay, the pre-sale is starting, send some tokens to this address. So really easy access, low barriers to entry to doing. Barriers to entry are also available to people who want to do good things. And so I think this ecosystem will rapidly self-organize. We're part of a lot of those efforts, and we will see, and we've already seen in many cases, real solid analysis, organized information, and ways of protecting the consumer from situations that they need to be protected from.
Great.
Let me just add one note on the legal side
Yes.
of things here. Actually, one of the things I think that's going to be helpful in this overemphasis on tokens is the law, because recently the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission issued sort of a legal post-mortem on the Dow, and one of the consequences of that is that exchanges are going through and looking at those hundreds of tokens that they have listed and saying which ones of these actually fall afoul of the guidance, and tokens are starting to be dropped for legal reasons, because the SEC made it clear that not only the tokens issuers, but also the exchanges can be liable if they're listing and selling things that actually should be considered to be securities. So that will help partially in getting rid of some of the things where tokens have a very speculative kind of investment, focus behind them. But the question is, what do we do then with the projects that are actually really good ideas, that are new ways of financing things? Because not everything that you do in the technology world needs to have a token, and there's other ways of raising money. And usually, if there's not a functionality to the token, if there's not a reason why your protocol should have a token in it, then you shouldn't be raising money with a token. So that we should just do away with. But there are projects that are using tokens in functionally interesting ways to do kinds of financial arrangements that are not possible in the existing financial structure. And the question is, where are those projects going to go? Because they're going to get dropped from the exchanges currently. And all the new exchanges, I can tell you as a lawyer, the exchanges are now actually requiring listing agreements. They're requiring all the new tokens to provide memos with legal opinions that we're not a security, we're not a regulated commodity, we're not this, that, or the other. So the exchanges have kind of got the fear of God now. And that's going to close down some of the innovation. And the question is going to be which country, which jurisdiction, who is going to come up with a structure to somehow sensibly make it possible for these other experiments to happen, and not just delist everybody.
My response is because I'm really at the street level in this ecosystem. It won't be possible to just shut things down just because there's so much activity by the startups. It's so difficult to predict the life of a startup. That has to take place. The innovation has to take place and has to go forward. So nobody can theorize and say, well, this doesn't look right, so we're going to close it. It has to take its life. And so I'm kind of worried when regulators can kind of predict the life of a startup, because nobody can.
Yeah.
So,
And that's why I say, where are they going to go? The good projects that need to have some place to go and to prove themselves.
But there's already, as you indicated, a pretty good structure in place. It's called the law, securities law. And we were delighted to read the report on the Dow. It confirmed all the legal work that we've been doing. It also, I think, importantly indicated that the SEC would look at the details of every situation, just like they do in the legacy world. And so the United States I consider quite favorable to either tokenized securities or securities that with appropriate legal work, or tokens that with appropriate legal work would not be deemed securities by the SEC, but could in fact be utility tokens or protocol
that's
tokens.
the key part.
So
Many
I
tokens are
think
not securities.
I think there are lots of jurisdictions that will be very friendly to appropriately structured projects.
One kind of counterpoint I will give to a lot of this is that there is a big difference between not being a security and not being a scam.
Right.
And often enough, projects that optimize for not being a security are actually, in some ways, like I actually think the median utility token is scammier than the median security token, basically because they rely on these, like the facts that they have to claim that they are a utility token basically means that they have to contort their economic model, and this often ends up making them valueless. Yeah. So, this is, I think, one of the reasons why the suggestion that, there needs to be some place that tries to approach the whole problem in the way that's balanced and sensible, I think is very valuable.
Yeah. So the SEC does go after situations where they deem that somebody is sold to an unregistered security that doesn't qualify for any exemptions. But they also go after just fraudulent projects that harm consumers.
So after we come back from the audience, I'm going to ask you the same question so we can think about it. I want to ask you your wish for the next 6 months. So think about that while we come back. Okay, so let's take questions. Do I just pick anybody, Nabil, and just, okay, please. Do they have any speakers or, any mics? So I repeat the question, okay.
Yeah,
So can I repeat the question for the just the recording? The question is, summarizing it, is what is the recourse for when things go wrong compared to like the Visa network? There is a recourse, you go to them. What's going to happen in the blockchain space when there are smart contracts that are barely legal?
Short answer, we're in the first minute of this revolution, and the situation that you're describing is basically like somebody who has access to a bank's database system who's transferring things around improperly, basically. So we and many others in the space are building better versions of identity and control of value tokens that will enable people to lose their phone, lose their laptop, etc., and recover tokens that are their private keys, basically, that enable them to control their identity and their value tokens. So very early days still. With respect to different kinds of financial infrastructures, we're going to be building layers and layers on top of the raw blockchain. And so there will be many protection mechanisms built over the next few years.
So there is hope.
But I think importantly, one of the revolutions of this technology is that if you want to put the work into it, if you're savvy enough, you can get into that bank and move your money around by yourself.
Okay, let's go there. And yes.
What was the first question? Okay, so the question.
So just yeah. Also, go ahead. Repeat it.
Yeah, so just for everyone who doesn't know, WebAssembly is an effort that was started by Martin Bexey, and there's some other developers working on it too, that basically tries to take WebAssembly, which is an existing project that tries to make a standardized VM for virtual machine for browsers, and adapts it so that it has the right properties for Ethereum-style blockchains. And this is definitely an interesting effort, and there are quite a few people that support the Ethereum virtual machine eventually either just becoming WebAssembly or using WebAssembly as an interpreter for it. And even if this does not happen, WebAssembly is already being used in Ethereum in other contexts. So I believe that, for example, TrueBit, which is a verifier for large-scale kind of cloud computing type computation on Ethereum, it uses, as I believe, it uses WebAssembly as a base. So it is definitely something that can enable both increased efficiency and increased ability to use existing programming languages.
Thanks. Yes. Okay. So question is are there any efforts going on at the global level in the area of security for banking? Maybe Joseph or Julie?
Specifically security for banking, for token launches? So there is a tokens working group that has been established or is being established at the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. We didn't start it. One of the biggest banks in the organization started it. There's a group called the Accounting Blockchain Coalition, I believe. We did start that. It consists of some of the Big Four and other accounting firms. They are looking at what tokens are, how to report on tokens, etc. Again, it's an infrastructure for collaboration, and so these institutions are springing up because lots of different actors want to build shared infrastructure. It's pretty exciting.
I think in terms of the global legal regulatory level, certainly the Financial Action Task Force is paying a lot of attention to what's going on in the blockchain space, and they have various different working groups going on. Their focus is not so much on regulating securities, because securities have historically been regulated on a country-by-country basis, with, of course, a lot of cooperation amongst countries when things cross borders or have cross-border implications. But securities law tends to be anchored around the idea of it affecting the internal market. So the jurisdiction of the securities regulator comes from the fact that whatever the activity is affecting the internal market. Obviously, in a blockchain world, something that's happening anywhere in the world can be affecting your internal market. So that means that everyone has jurisdiction over everything, which is problematic. Especially for the entrepreneurs who don't know whose standards they should be designing to. But there are efforts to have these conversations. There is a working group within the Commonwealth happening. There are efforts within the G20 to take up conversations about this. There are efforts, dialogues happening at the IMF and the World Bank. And then there are many sort of industry lobby groups and players like the Digital Chamber of Commerce, the Ethereum Enterprise Alliance, Koala, the Coalition of Automated Legal Associations, lots of other efforts going on to try and have these dialogues. But the fact is, we don't really have a superstructure for global governance. We have this nation-state system where we make treaties with each other, and once in a while we manage to establish something that has some kind of a jurisdiction at a global scale, but that's really the exception and not the rule. The World Trade Organization, for example, has its own dispute settlement system, or we've got the International Court of Justice, or we've got a few things out there, but most international law is soft law. So it's sort of a set of gentlemen's agreements. And that means that countries have to come together in working groups and cooperate. And that's what we're seeing in the blockchain space. I think what's novel and what's exciting about blockchain is that it's much more of a fundamental public-private partnership model from the very get-go, because the governments don't understand it from the beginning, and they have to be informed about it by the startups. And so the only way to come up with sensible ways of approaching these problems is to really come into conversation with the people who are building the technologies. And I think that's very fundamentally helpful.
Great. Yes.
Why the what? Oh.
I can probably answer that too. Anybody from Kik here? Maybe they can.
Is there anyone from Kik here? No.
I was an advisor to them.
Please go ahead. You've been working with the Canadian regulators.
The short answer is that they said that. I'm not saying anything that's not public. The OSC, they felt that the OSC did not give them a clear enough guidance in terms of including the Canadians. And they made that decision to not risk anything. And but then the greater topic here is that the OSC, this is another topic, should be giving a clearer guidance, not just to Kik, but to the market. They owe it to us to give us better guidance that is more clearly defined so that the companies know where they stand. And right now, I've written an open letter to the OSC last week, and I specified a number of things they could be doing, basically. So unfortunately, that's the situation. In BC, they're a little bit more open-minded right now. I'm seeing more openness from the BCSC and from the Quebec regulators as well. But there is hope. We're not gonna stop. We're gonna keep talking to them and helping them understand what they should be doing.
I think generally speaking, this is very much a chicken and egg problem right now for the entrepreneurs, though, because sometimes it actually is better to ask forgiveness than permission. and
some have done that, yes.
And it's just a risk analysis that they have to undertake. If there's lack of guidance or there's unclear guidance, either they seek out a jurisdiction where they feel more comfortable, which is happening a lot with people going to Switzerland or Singapore or whatever, or they just go for it and they figure we'll just see what happens. And Usually, if they're good people and they have a good idea and they try in good faith, then on the back end, their regulators will work with them to work out some sort of reasonable arrangement. But you can't count on that. It is a risk.
Yeah.
Maybe just time-wise, should we stop at 4? There's 10 minutes to go. 3 more questions? Okay, 3 more questions.
Let me just jump in quickly. We speak to regulators and securities regulators around the world. We seek out appropriate jurisdictions for our different projects. We have noticed, so you indicate that they should get their act together, but it's complicated. We have noticed in the attitudes a reluctance to come down too hard. We've noticed that there is interest in letting this unfold to some degree, stomping on things that are obviously in violation. But I think that with respect to asking permission versus asking for forgiveness, I think we might be able to justifiably err on the going for it side of things, because while regulators around the world have their own careers and they identify situations that will advance those careers, you probably don't want to be the person who kills blockchain, who kills this tremendous growth engine for your jurisdiction. So I think that they're going to, in many cases, take a wait-and-see approach to a lot of these things unless there's something egregious going on.
Okay, let's take 3 more questions and try to maybe give short answers as well. Yes, over there, there's a hand in blue. All I see is a blue hand. Yeah. I can't hear, I'm sorry.
In your talk, you compared Ethereum as the new Java, but today the language of it there is JavaScript, right? So I'm wondering, do you see something which is going to parallel JavaScript in the Ethereum world coming up?
So
So
first
Java
of
and
all,
Ethereum.
Ethereum applications already use JavaScript for the user interface side. For the smart contract side, you specifically want programming languages that optimize for security, which means 2 things. So first of all, like Java, the thing with JavaScript, right, is that it's a language that errs on the side of just keeping on going at all costs. Like if you say dog -1 in JavaScript, it doesn't return an error, it just says dog -1 equals nan. And yeah, this is like, whereas, no. Well, so I mean, I think like as far as programming languages go, right? Like I think that like there do needs to be programming languages that are specifically well designed for the smart contract environment. And I think in the web environment, in many cases, having a language where dog -1 equals nan, and you just keep on trying your best and like do whatever, like just keep going and see what happens, may well actually be a totally okay thing to do, because very often the cost of failure is low. But in a smart contract, the goal is specifically to, number 1, minimize risks. And so you want a language that basically forces the user to even over-specify what the contract does, so that the programming language can check if the specification is self-consistent, and if it isn't, return an error before even the contract even gets compiled. And the second thing is that you want to create contracts that are easy to audit. So you want to number 1, like make default code easy to read, and you want it to be maximally hard to write code which is misleading. And this is a different set of properties from properties that traditional programming languages have, and so this is a specific niche that will needs to be optimized for over time. But it is definitely like the kind of niche that there will be things will continue to be developed for and will continue to be improved over the next few years.
Yeah, I think it's useful to think of Ethereum as the back end of applications. It is akin to the database in traditional applications, and so there are different ways of interacting with the Java virtual machine or writing code for that machine. And there are lots of different ways of building user interfaces that speak to the Ethereum network.
By the way, my Java analogy was metaphorical, not literal. One more question then. I'm going to close my eyes and there, at the back, yes. The role of Amazon and the big players.
I think, first of all, definitely, as far as this is probably also a follow-up to my answer on surprises, is that I have been surprised by just how little interest, relatively speaking, we've seen from like the Google, Twitter, Facebook, Amazon, Reddit side of the tech ecosystem to blockchain technology in general. So like if you had asked me 5 years ago, like which sectors would be most and least interested, I would have said companies like that most interested and governments among the least interested. And it turns out government's among the most interested and they are among the least interested. As for why, I would expect that like one of my hypotheses is basically just that look, blockchains are easiest to get traction in areas where the existing technology sucks. And finance is an area where existing technology sucks. And government is, sorry, but it's also an area where existing technology sucks. Like it's 2016 and you still have to do a huge number of things on paper. Come on. And it's 2017, we still have to do things on paper. So, like this is the sort of thing, like basically you're competing against stuff which is much older. And even whereas with like in the tech ecosystem, you're already competing against the snappy new thing, and so like it is in some ways just kind of harder to get a leg up in that sense. Another thing is that blockchains are the kind of technology which is fundamentally about like things like increasing safety and reducing the need for trust, and those are just things that are naturally just take more time to get adopted. And it's the sort of thing that, like practically speaking, once again, the tech sector has focused on less because at the least the immediate consequences are lower. And it's like the fact is, okay, Equifax got hacked, and there's been a number of large media splats, but it's not the same. Like still life goes on, right? Like it's still very bad, but it's also easier to spend less time thinking about. Whereas,
I think, sorry.
Like other sectors, like I think are, there are places where, like, first of all, the existing technology is less integrated, and also where the specific trade-offs that blockchains give you are kind of, a more natural thing that can get integrated more easily. I do expect that over time this is going to change, especially as the cost of using a blockchain starts to decrease, and to the point where it actually becomes viable for applications going beyond finance. But this is going to take some time.
I think it's going to change really rapidly when self-sovereign identity starts to gain real traction in the marketplace. And the more governments adopt this, the more companies adopt this, the more startups start using this as a business model, because Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, they all make money on our data. Their fundamental business model is our data. And once it's possible for us to control our data and decide who is able to monetize it,
Great. Just to close, 10-second answer, starting with Julie. What's your wish in the next 6 months for the blockchain ecosystem and Ethereum in particular?
So my wish for the next 6 months is really simple. I work with lots of governments and intergovernmental agencies all the time, and my wish is that everybody who goes around and sells an idea to a government or an intergovernmental agency or corporates or whoever it is upfront about both the amazing possibilities and also about the current weaknesses and the scalability problems, the privacy concerns, the things that you need to worry about on the regulatory side, and it just be upfront about that.
Okay.
Let's talk about it in a realistic way.
Be realistic. Mm-hmm. Joseph.
Oh, realistic. Okay, I can do that.
No, I'm just summarizing Julie's.
Oh, okay. Then I won't be realistic.
You can be whatever you want.
Things are going so astonishingly well that I don't see a lot of impediments. I just see a lot of parallel tracks for forward progress. Our biggest difficulty is spinning up enough people to handle the onslaught of incoming and the limited amount of time each day. So if there's a time dilation device out there that we can get early access to, that would be my wish.
Faster and more developers. Good.
And I would say the more as long as we can get consistent ongoing technical progress in proof of stake, scalability, privacy, and if that continues going smoothly, then I'll be very happy.
Scalability, privacy. Great. Thank you very much. Big round of applause for the panelists. Okay.